Chapter 992. Senior Brother Chu is still in seclusion. When he comes out, his strength will definitely increase. I have to work harder. Outside the stone pavilion, Zhong Mukan paused for a moment before turning around to enter seclusion. Zhong Mukan wasn't the only one working hard. The other disciples of the Soaring Sky Academy were also working very hard. They were several times more hard-working than usual. All of this was brought about by Chu Mu. Chu Mu's arrival had fulfilled the Soaring Sky Academy's dream of soaring to the heavens. No one could rival him, and this greatly motivated the Soaring Sky Academy's disciples. When the news of Chu Mu becoming the #1 fortune disciple spread, the Soaring Sky Academy's disciples were incomparably excited, as if they had been injected with chicken blood. The aura of cultivation was very dense. Every Soaring Sky Academy's disciples' strength had increased significantly. Unfortunately, to a swordsman, talent was incomparably important. As long as they cultivated diligently, their strength would increase steadily. However, it was very difficult to advance by leaps and bounds. Therefore, other than Chu Mu, no other disciple of the Soaring Sky Academy had succeeded in the Sword of Gojoseon. Thinking about it, if it wasn't for the comprehension of the fortune's secret domain, it wouldn't have been easy for Chu Mu, Song Mo, Lu Yi, and the others to succeed in the Sword of Gojoseon. Inside the stone pavilion, Chu Mu took out the time compass and 10 grains of high-grade sand of time. There were a total of 13 grains of high-grade sand of time. The power of time contained within each grain was much stronger than the low-grade and mid-grade sand of time. The low-grade sand of time could turn 1 month into 2 months, the mid-grade sand of time's effect doubled, turning 1 month into 4 months, and the high-grade sand of time's effect doubled again, turning 1 month into 8 months. Using the time compass, 10 grains of advanced time sand would cause the time to change from 1 month to 80 months. In other words, 1 month in the outside world was equivalent to 80 months for Chu Mu, who was under the time compass power. He didn't regret at all that he had forgotten to use the time compass and the high-grade sand of time. Good steel should be used on the edge of a blade. In the beginning, the transformation from profound to law wouldn't take as much time. It would only take 5 times as long as one type after another. Now, if he wanted to transform the 4th type of law, under normal circumstances, he would need 250 days, which would be more than 8 months. After embedding the high-grade sands of time into the time compass, he activated its power. Immediately, the time compass released a time barrier that enveloped Chu Mu. Chu Mu immediately felt an incomparably intense energy fluctuation invading his body. It was as if he was isolated from the outside world, forming an independent world. In this independent world, the flow of time slowed down. The 4th profound he chose was the Thunder Profound. Theoretically, it would take 250 days to transform the Thunder Upanishad into the rule of thunder. In fact, it was the same. The reason why the refinement of profound meanings would become more difficult and longer was because the principal energy in the spiritual world would repel the principal energy from the outside world from entering. To put it bluntly, it meant that the spiritual world was his territory and no one else was allowed to enter. In the beginning, the spiritual world was filled with profound energy. It wasn't as strong as the principal energy and was powerless to resist the entry of principal energy. However, when a profound in the spiritual world successfully transformed into the principal energy, it would naturally emit an aura of resistance. The principal energy of space was stronger than ordinary principal energy. Its resistance was also stronger. Otherwise, Chu Mu wouldn't need to spend 10 days to transform the metal profound into the rule of metal. Perhaps it would only take 5 days. The more principal energy that transformed, the stronger the resistance to external principal energy would be. This was an unconscious process that couldn't be interfered with. In 250 days, which was 8 months and 10 days, Chu Mu successfully transformed the Thunder Profound into the rule of thunder. The 5th profound was the Profound of Water. 5 times the time, which was 41 months and 20 days, the rule of water appeared. At this point, the time compass had consumed more than half of its power. Out of 80 months, only 30 months were left. The transformation of the 6th profound requires more than 200 months, which is at least 17 years. The remaining 30 months aren't enough. While pondering, Chu Mu changed his train of thought. Why don't I use the 30 months to familiarize myself with the transformed principal energy and master the sword skills as much as possible to increase my attack power? 5 types of rules: metal rule, wind rule, thunder rule, water rule, and space rule. At the profound level, they all had corresponding sword technique. As long as Chu Mu was familiar with each type of rule, he would be able to grasp the corresponding sword technique again. It would be best if he could master the sword skills of all 5 principles within 30 months. However, it was a little extravagant. Chu Mu had to make another choice. The first choice in his mind was naturally the space principle because space scar was very powerful. Once mastered, it would become an Earth rank sword skill and its power wouldn't be inferior to a grade 4 sword skill. It would allow him to have a tyrannical attack power that could threaten the Samsung sword of Gojoseon. Similarly, the time required to master the space principle was much longer than the other principles. It might be 10 times, a dozen times, or even longer. 30 months sounded very long, but it was only 2.5 years. It would pass in the blink of an eye. After weighing the pros and cons, Chu Mu made his choice. His first choice was the metal principle. If there was enough time, his second choice would be the wind principle. Without hesitation, Chu Mu's divine sense locked onto the metal principle in his spiritual world and began to comprehend it. Different from other swordsmen, Chu Mu's profound had been refined to the limit of the 9th revolution. It was hard to say if there was a second one in the entire immemorial world. After transforming into principles, his principles had reached the peak of the divine realm. Compared to other sword of Gojoseon, Chu Mu saved a lot of time and energy. Because his principles had reached the limit, he didn't need to work on improving his principles. Similarly, the higher the level of principles, not only would it be more powerful, but it would also be clearer to the principles. This meant that the efficiency of mastering principles would be higher. Principles were the transformation and sublimation of profound. The way to master principles was similar to the way to master profound. The principle was the same, but because principles were 10 times stronger than profound, the difficulty of mastering principles was naturally many times higher. The sharpness and sharpness of metal were like swords and sabers that could cut through everything. Any hard object would be cut and pierced by the sharpness of metal. When it reached the limit, it could even cut through nothingness. A trace of gold appeared on Chu Mu's finger with a thought. It wrapped around his finger, revealing a layer of gold. His finger waved in the air like a sharp sword being unsheathed. It easily cut through the air, leaving behind fine traces of gold. Sitting cross-legged on the praying mat without moving, Chu Mu used his finger as a sword and performed a sword technique. It was the metal sword technique. After performing it several times, Chu Mu was surprised to find that the metal sword technique was actually helpful in mastering the metal principle. After understanding this, Chu Mu became even more attentive. While communicating with the metal principle in his spiritual world, he felt every fluctuation. At the same time, he used the metal principle's power to perform the metal sword technique, increasing his understanding and mastery of the metal sword technique. Although the improvement was small, Chu Mu felt that he had made progress. Very good. Using his finger as a sword, Chu Mu performed the metal sword technique over and over again tirelessly. At the beginning, there was a sequence, but from the first move to the 9th move, it gradually became disordered. The first move and the next move became the 5th or 6th move, and the move after that became the 2nd or 9th move. In short, Chu Mu's mind seemed to have opened up, and he was relying on his instincts to cultivate. Wherever his finger passed, gold scratches would appear in the space around him. It took a while for them to disappear. If Chu Mu merged the undying sword intent, those gold scratches would remain for a long time. Immersed in cultivation, Chu Mu didn't know the passage of time. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. Chu Mu's finger stopped in midair. Then, a golden light burst out from his finger and condensed. A golden sword appeared on Chu Mu's finger. With a slash in the air, the sword slashed down. An extremely sharp aura seemed to be telling Chu Mu that this sword could cut through anything. The sound of cloth being torn apart could be heard. In an instant, where the sword slashed down, a dazzling golden light appeared, forming a straight golden sword mark that seemed to cut through space. Sword technique, slash iron. Chu Mu had finally grasped the rules of metal. He also had a preliminary mastery of the first sword technique, slash iron. Next, as long as he spent some time practicing, he would be able to regain his previous mastery. Cultivating in seclusion was the most boring, but Chu Mu was immersed in it. He didn't feel tired at all. If he could continue to improve, he would even want to continue cultivating. Another 3 months passed. In these 3 months, Chu Mu performed slash iron again and again until his spiritual sense was exhausted. After recovering, he continued to perform it. His mastery of slash iron continued to improve. After 3 months, although he still hadn't reached his previous mastery, he could already perform it as he wished. Next, I'll master the rules of wind. The method of mastering the rules of wind was the same as the method of mastering the rules of metal. It was to mobilize the rules of wind in the spiritual world and condense it on the finger. Using the finger as a sword, he would perform the wind sword technique. Fortunately, mastering the rules of wind wouldn't be like metamorphosis. After mastering the first one, the difficulty of mastering the second one would increase exponentially. In the same 12 months, Chu Mu regained his mastery of the rules of wind. Back then, he used the wind profound to create a sword technique called slash wind. It fused sword origin, sword intent, and the wind profound to trigger a powerful wind blade. At this moment, Chu Mu's finger slashed in the air and a thin green wind blade shot out. This move only fused with the rules of wind and not sword origin and sword intent. Therefore, it dissipated quickly. However, it represented that Chu Mu had regained his mastery of slash wind. Chapter 993. The days of flying snow were long gone. Everything came back to life. Spring was warm and flowers were blooming. The trees were lush and full of vitality. The sun was shining high in the sky. A beam of light streaked across the sky and disappeared into the horizon. After leaving the soaring sky court, the light shadow spun and descended from the sky. He drew his sword in the air. In an instant, a gust of wind blew between heaven and earth, accompanied by the whimper of the wind. Sword light appeared and a green light flashed. The non-return sword was swung out. In an instant, a green wind blade condensed on the sword and shot out into the sky. The wind was cut open, leaving a crack in the void. The 1-meter-long green wind blade revealed a metallic luster. The green wind blade fell from the sky at a speed 10 times faster than the speed of sound. It was unbelievably fast. Wherever it passed, the boulders were as fragile as tofu and were cut open. After cutting open more than a dozen boulders, it slashed into the hard ground, breaking open the ground and forming a bottomless crack. The light shadow spun and landed. It was Chu Mu. He came outside to test the power of the sword's skill. The power of the earth rank wind blade is indeed more than a dozen times stronger than that of the human rank. Chu Mu nodded with a smile. The power of the rules of wind was 10 times stronger than the profound meaning of wind. The first sky of creation's sword spirit was several times stronger than the limit of the god condensation realm. The king's sword will was several times stronger than that of the god condensation realm. With such a combination, although it was not a terrifying increase, it was at least a dozen times stronger. Because of the undying sword will, the power of sword skills at the same level was much stronger than ordinary sword will. It could be said that the current wind blade was at the top of the Earth rank first grade Earth rank sword skills. If he used the King's Undying Sword Will at the limit of the 9th transformation realm and the Heaven rank's top rule power, the power would increase again and be even more terrifying. After releasing a few more wind blade sword skills, all the boulders around were cut open. Chumu found a new target and performed the Steel Blade sword skill. Steel Blade was a close-range sword skill, while Wind Blade was a long-range sword skill. One was close-range and one was long-range. They each had their own strengths and could complement each other. After a series of experiments, Chumu floated in the air, holding the no-return sword tightly. His eyes became extremely sharp, emitting an astonishing light. The scorching sun in the sky seemed to have lost its splendor. Green and gold flashed in his eyes at the same time, like white clouds passing by. The precepts of gold and precepts of wind were activated at the same time. They flowed out and infused into the sword of no return. They intertwined and merged with the sword essence and sword will. The sword of no return seemed to tremble uncontrollably. Chumu's expression changed slightly, and he hurriedly swung his sword, which was incomparably resplendent. The green-gold wind blade was like a crescent moon breaking through the sky. Its speed was twice as fast as the wind. In the blink of an eye, it cut through the sky and disappeared without a trace. Chumu looked at the no-return sword in his hand and frowned, revealing a look of pity. The no-return sword was a peak royal grade sword. Its toughness and toughness were shocking, and it was incomparably sharp. Chumu used it very well, and it had accompanied him through many battles. So he more or less had some feelings for the no-return sword. But now there were a few indiscernible cracks on the body of the no-return sword. Looking at the cracks, Chumu knew that the no-return sword was damaged and could no longer be used in battle. Even if he used a sword technique, the no-return sword would shatter. When he was experimenting with the sword technique earlier, he did not think it through. He was so focused on the sword technique that he forgot about the quality of the no-return sword. Could barely withstand an Earth Grade 1 sword technique, but it could not withstand an Earth Grade 2 sword technique. With a trace of regret, Chumu stored the no-return sword in his interspatial ring. He flew back to the Mural Palace. He had comprehended a Grade 5 sword technique, so he would be rewarded with 5,000 fairy points. Senior Brother Zhong, thank you for your help that day. Chumu returned 1,000 fairy points to Zhong Mukin. Zhong Mukin smiled and carefully looked at Chumu. He was a little surprised. Senior Brother Chu, your strength. I'm going to report to the Heaven-Breaking Courtyard. The next time we meet will probably be in the Heaven-Breaking Courtyard, Chumu said. Congratulations, Chu. Just as Zhong Mukin was about to congratulate him, he suddenly thought of something and his body trembled. His face was filled with shock. Senior Brother Chu. Because he was too shocked, Zhong Mukin's mind was in a mess, and he could not speak properly. That's right. I had a fortuitous encounter when I went out to train. My cultivation talent increased from Grade 5 to Grade 4, and now, I have successfully broken through to the creation realm, Chumu said with a faint smile. Senior Brother Chu, you've become the Sword of Gojoseon? After a while, Zhong Mukin recovered from his shock. The shock on his face was still there. Chumu nodded. Congratulations, Senior Brother Chu. Zhong Mukin let out a long breath and sincerely congratulated him. I knew it. Senior Brother Chu is definitely not a person who stays in a pond. Once there's a fortuitous encounter, you will definitely rise to the heavens. Becoming the Sword of Gojoseon is just a new beginning. It's not considered rising to the heavens, Chumu said. In short, congratulations, Senior Brother Chu. Zhong Mukin said half-jokingly. I also have to work hard and try to comprehend the mysteries of creation within 2 years. I'll reach the creation realm and become the Sword of Gojoseon. When I enter the Heaven-Breaking Courtyard, I'll need Senior Brother Chu's protection. See you in the Heaven-Breaking Courtyard, Chu Mu said seriously. Zhong Mukin could be considered a good friend. See you in the heaven-breaking courtyard, Zhong Mukin said seriously. After that, Chu Mu left the sky-rising courtyard and headed to the heaven-breaking courtyard. Zhong Mukin told the other disciples of the sky-rising courtyard the news. Immediately, the disciples were shocked. Then, they were overjoyed. The 3 courtyards of the sky-soaring courtyard were located in one place, and the heaven-breaking courtyard was located in another. He turned into a ray of light and flew quickly in the direction of the heaven-breaking courtyard. About 2 hours later, Chu Mu saw the outline of the heaven-breaking courtyard. It was also a valley. There were countless fierce and powerful auras in the valley, and there were many sword towers of different shapes standing in the valley. Chu Mu landed in front of the valley entrance of the heaven-breaking courtyard. The first thing he saw was a black stone tablet standing on the ground at the entrance of the heaven-breaking courtyard. The stone tablet was 10 meters tall, and it was like a sword stabbed into the ground. The blade of the sword was straight and pointed at the sky. It gave off a fierce feeling as if it could pierce through the sky. On the black sword monument was a row of large characters carved deeply into the wood. Chu Mu's gaze fell upon it and was immediately attracted. In a trance, he seemed to see an exceptional swordsman holding a sharp sword. He moved as he pleased, as if he were a heavenly steed soaring through the skies, boundless and untraceable. Using the sword as a pen, he carved large characters one after another on the black sword monument. Every word contained a shocking sharpness and fierceness. Every stroke seemed to be formed by a sharp sword. Staring at those words, Chu Mu only felt the sharpness and fierceness contained in every word after the peerless swordsman disappeared. In an instant they burst out and turned into sharp swords. They executed different sword moves and slashed at him. In an instant, Chu Mu was surrounded by hundreds of sharp swords. The power of every sword move was shocking. Chu Mu's expression was calm. A sword appeared in his mind and fought against the dozens of sharp swords, blocking and counterattacking. The dozens of sharp swords attacked like a storm, but they couldn't do anything to Chu Mu. In an instant, the dozens of sharp swords soared into the sky and suddenly exploded, condensing into a huge sword. It hovered above Chu Mu's head, and an incomparably terrifying aura poured down without restraint. It was like a 10,000 zhang tall waterfall crashing down. The huge sword hovered in the sky as if a brilliant heavenly might was suppressing it. Chu Mu was shocked, and he couldn't move his body. It was as if his whole body was about to be crushed. There seemed to be a voice in the unseen world questioning him. Facing the brilliant heavenly might, why didn't he kneel? He actually dared to disrespect the heavens, and he should be punished by the heavens and turned into ashes. That voice was vast and resounding, and it descended from the sky. The heavenly might was terrifying, and it was like a prison or an abyss. Chu Mu raised his head to look at the sky. The sword energy in his body roared crazily, and the power of his divine sense condensed. His incomparably tenacious willpower resisted the brilliant heavenly might. Even if his body trembled uncontrollably, he would not yield. Who is this person? He actually resisted the heaven-breaking sword steel's aura? At the entrance of the heaven-breaking courtyard, 3 Sword of Gojoseon walked in. They were immediately attracted by Chu Mu. An unfamiliar face. I've never seen him before. He probably just broke through to the Sword of Gojoseon and came to report to our heaven-breaking courtyard. That should be the case. Otherwise, he wouldn't be stupid enough to resist the heaven-breaking sword steel's aura. I heard that not long ago, there were 2 new Sword of Gojoseon. One of them didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth, and was stupid enough to resist the heaven-breaking sword steel's aura. In the end, he knelt on the spot and made a fool of himself. In the entire heaven-breaking courtyard, there are less than 30 people who can resist the heaven-breaking sword steel's aura. A mere new Sword of Gojoseon wants to resist the heaven-breaking sword steel's aura? He really doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. That's right. He doesn't know anything and is so reckless. If he goes out with this kind of mentality, he won't live long. The three Sword of Gojoseon seemed to have nothing better to do. They actually stood there and looked at Chu Mu. They wanted to see the scene of Chu Mu kneeling and making a fool of himself. Boundless heavenly might pressed down, and Chu Mu resisted it. The sword stands between heaven and earth, casting its sharpness. It can break through enemies and achieve victory. We cultivate the sword, so we should be like a sword that stands between heaven and earth. So what if it's a mere heavenly might? Watch my sword break it. A tyrannical intent spiraled in his mind, and a powerful sharpness condensed on Chu Mu's body. Vaguely, his aura seemed to have transformed into a sword that faced off against the huge sword in the sky. Chu Mu's resistance seemed to have angered the huge sword in the sky. The heavenly might became even stronger. Thunder rumbled, and the sky darkened. The huge sword fell from the sky like a meteor. Break! With a loud shout, Chu Mu's sharp aura condensed into a sword that instantly soared into the sky and faced off against the huge sword. In an instant, the two swords closed in on each other. The veins on Chu Mu's forehead bulged, and he used all his strength to retreat. He really doesn't know what's good for him. He actually chose to face off against the heaven-breaking sword Steel's aura. If he loses, his spiritual world will be severely damaged. Without several years of recuperation, he won't be able to recover. The three Sword of Gojoseon turned pale with fright. At this moment, Chu Mu's sharp aura and unyielding sword collided with the huge sword that was descending from the sky. In an instant, heaven and earth lost its color. Thunder rumbled, and the world seemed to be destroyed. Chapter 994. Heaven and earth trembled as if everything was being torn apart. Above the heaven-breaking courtyard, a clap of thunder could be heard. What's going on? This phenomenon. Could it be that someone has won against the heaven-breaking sword Steel? Many Sword of Gojoseon were alarmed by the commotion. They all used their movement techniques and rushed toward the entrance of the heaven-breaking courtyard. The three Sword of Gojoseon were dumbstruck. He won. The person in front of them was obviously a new disciple of the Sword of Gojoseon. Not only did he not crumble under the pressure of the heaven-breaking sword Steel, he even managed to break through the sword Steel's pressure. An incomparably powerful sword aura revolved around his body and rose up into the heavens. After destroying the sword aura that was like the might of the heavens, a feeling of invincibility suddenly rose up in Chu Mu's heart. In the blink of an eye, he withdrew his sword aura. He looked at the three Sword of Gojoseon, who were staring at him with their mouths agape, and walked toward the entrance of the heaven-breaking courtyard. As his figure gradually disappeared into the distance, the three Sword of Gojoseon finally reacted and looked at each other. I remember that the only person who could win against the heaven-breaking sword Steel after becoming a Sword of Gojoseon was our first senior brother, right? One of the Sword of Gojoseon said weakly. The other two Sword of Gojoseon nodded vigorously. That's right. Among the disciples of the heaven-breaking courtyard that they knew, only their first senior brother, Qin Tianyi, had managed to win against the heaven-breaking sword Steel's pressure when he had just become a Sword of Gojoseon. In fact, from what they knew, other than Qin Tianyi, there was no other Ichino Sword of Gojoseon that could win against the heaven-breaking sword Steel's pressure. Even many of the Samsung Sword of Gojoseon's intermediate Sword of Gojoseon couldn't do it. They didn't understand that resisting the heaven-sundering sword Steel's sword force had nothing to do with one's cultivation. The group of people quickly rushed over, brushing past Chu Mu. They didn't even look at Chu Mu. When they reached the entrance of the valley, they first looked at the heaven-breaking sword Steel, then looked at the three Sword of Gojoseon, and frowned. Were you guys fighting against the heaven-sundering Sword of Gojoseon? A mid-tier Sword of Gojoseon asked the three low-tier Sword of Gojoseon. It wasn't us, it was a new disciple of the Heaven-Breaking Academy, one of the three low-tier Sword of Gojoseon hurriedly replied. Where? Everyone was shocked. I just went in. Could it be him? Everyone couldn't help but remember that when they were rushing out, they brushed past a person. Now that they thought about it, they didn't seem to have seen that person's face before. One had to know that in the entire heaven-breaking academy, there were only a few hundred disciples. Some were familiar with each other, and some were unfamiliar with each other. Even if they were unfamiliar with each other, they had at least seen each other a few times. Moreover, every sword of Gojoseon had a good memory. As long as they saw each other a few times, they would have an impression of each other. Chumu, it's you. An unconcealable cry of surprise rang out. Why did you come to the heaven-breaking academy? Your cultivation. Chumu turned his head and saw that it was Wang Wei from the Soaring Sky Academy. Could it be that you also? Wang Wei's face was filled with shock. He had a feeling that Chumu's cultivation was the same as his. First heavenly layer creation realm. Didn't they say that Chumu's cultivation talent was only at the 5th grade? Didn't a 5th grade cultivation talent stop at the divine condensation realm? Could it be the moment he saw Chumu, Wang Wei's thoughts raced several times faster than usual. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind, so fast that he didn't even notice them. Senior Brother Wang, hello. Chumu greeted him indifferently. Wang Wei took a deep breath and tried his best to calm himself down. However, his face was still filled with shock. He carefully sized up Chumu and carefully sensed Chumu's aura. After confirming it several times, Chumu also released the aura of a first heavenly layer creation realm. Wang Wei's eyes widened. You really broke through to the creation realm. Is it that surprising that I broke through? Chumu asked in return. Many thoughts flashed through Wang Wei's mind. Soon after, Wang Wei calmed down. I'm indeed a little surprised. However, Junior Brother Chu really has great luck. Your cultivation talent has increased. By the way, Senior Brother Chu has just arrived at the Heaven-Breaking Academy. There are some things that you don't know, right? Please enlighten me, Senior Brother Wang. Chumu replied. He roughly understood the change in Wang Wei's attitude. It should be because he saw that Chumu had broken through to the creation realm and become the sword of Gojoseon. His attitude was different from before, and he wanted to befriend Chumu. In truth, there was no enmity between Chumu and Wang Wei. At most, they had challenged each other twice, and Chumu had defeated him both times. After all, they were both disciples of the Flying Heaven Pavilion and were fellow disciples. Even if they didn't become good friends, there was no need for them to become enemies. Moreover, Chumu didn't know much about the Heaven-Breaking Academy. Wang Wei had arrived earlier than him, so he definitely knew more than him. I wouldn't dare to enlighten you, but after you become a disciple of the Heaven-Breaking Academy, you will be able to obtain 1,000 fairy points every month, Wang Wei said. Also, you can enter the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower and challenge it. There's a chance for you to obtain a suitable holy sword of good quality. Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower. Chumu subconsciously turned his head and looked. He vaguely saw a tall tower standing on the ground in the distance. Chumu remembered that his sword of no return was damaged and couldn't be used anymore. Not to mention that he had become the sword of Gojoseon, so the sword suitable for him should be a holy sword. Holy swords were also divided into 4 grades: low, middle, high, and supreme. Most of the swords used by the sword of Gojoseon were low-grade holy sword. The higher the grade of the sword, the harder it was, the more tenacious it was, and the more powerful it was. The difference between the grades of holy swords was very obvious. The Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower's holy swords are different from ordinary holy swords. Among the same grade, it's stronger. It's a supreme grade holy sword of the same grade, Wang Wei said with envy. Senior Brother Wang, have you challenged it? Chumu asked. No, I'm still not strong enough. I plan to cultivate for a while and challenge it when I'm stronger, Wang Wei said without feeling embarrassed. However, Junior Brother Chu's talent is outstanding. Before you became the sword of Gojoseon, Your strength was already very strong among those of the same grade. Now that you've become the sword of Gojosian, your strength should be stronger than the average sword of Gojosian. You can give it a try. What's the price for challenging the heaven-breaking sword tower? Chumu asked. Every new disciple has one free chance. After that, you'll have to pay 10,000 fairy points for every challenge, Wang Wei said. 10,000 fairy points. Under normal circumstances, every sword of Gojosian would have to spend 10 months to obtain 10,000 fairy points. If junior brother Chu wants to challenge the heaven-breaking sword tower, I can lead the way for you, Wang Wei said. Okay. Chumu thought for a moment and nodded. 10,000 fairy points for one challenge was indeed not a small amount. But when he thought about it, it wasn't a lot either. A single closed-door cultivation would take 10 months, and he'd have another 10,000 fairy points. Not to mention, the first challenge was free. Chumu's mentality was different from Wang Wei's. Wang Wei probably cherished that one free challenge and felt that he was too weak. On the other hand, Chumu wanted to give it a try. If he failed, there was always a next time. The Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower was located at the end of the Valley of the Heaven-Breaking Academy. It was octagonal in shape and had a total of 9 floors. Each floor was very tall, as if it pierced through the clouds. The black Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower was like a giant sword that could support the heavens. It was both cold and sharp, and when one approached it, one would be able to smell the scent left behind by the passage of time. The closer one got to the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower, the more one would be able to feel the tyrannical aura of the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower, causing one's body to sink. Junior brother Chu, this is the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower. The way to enter is very simple. Just touch the tower. Wang Wei pointed at the black sword tower that pierced through the clouds and said. Chumu nodded as he looked at the sword tower. He strode towards the black sword tower. The closer he got, the greater the pressure he felt. Other than Chumu and Wang Wei, there were also some sort of Gojosian in the surroundings. When they saw Chumu walking towards the sword tower, they were all startled. From what they could sense, Chumu's cultivation was only at the first layer of Fortune Realm. Moreover, he was an unfamiliar face. This usually meant that Chumu was a new disciple of the Heaven-Breaking Academy. A new disciple actually wanted to challenge the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower. It was a bit too whimsical. However, they did not mock him. Many people were high-spirited when they first became Sword of Gojosian. They felt that there was nothing they could not do after their strength increased greatly. Only after experiencing some setbacks would they understand. Even though the pressure was great, Chumu still endured it and approached the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower. He stretched out his hand and pressed it against the tower. Immediately, a cold feeling spread through his body through his palm. A strange power enveloped Chumu at the same time. Before he could react, Chumu felt the world spin and appeared inside the sword tower. The light was dim in the spacious space. It was octagonal, and there were a total of 8 sealed doors. Chumu stood in the middle. He still did not understand what the challenge of the Heaven-Breaking Sword Tower was like. One of the doors opened, and a person walked out. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were filled with a shocking sharpness. They tore through the dim light and approached Chumu. The person exuded waves of sword origin at the first heaven of Blessed Realm, and they were calmer than Chumu's. He held a red longsword in his hand and walked toward Chumu step by step. His footsteps became faster and faster. His aura became stronger and fiercer. With a flash, he turned into a flash of light and appeared in front of Chumu. He thrust his sword forward, and his body moved with the sword. It went straight for Chumu's face. It was incredibly fierce, and it was like a shooting star shooting through the sky. The sword light shone brilliantly. With a thought, a sword naturally formed in Chumu's hand. It was in the form of non-return sword. He instantly blocked the attack, and under the powerful vibrations, he deflected the attack that came at him like a shooting star. Then, he counterattacked. He slashed out with his sword. It was an ordinary attack, but it also had a sharpness that could cut through mountains. With a ripping sound, the tip of the sword swept past the person's throat. Blood gushed out and the person fell forward. He had been killed in one strike. The body that fell forward and the blood that gushed out slowly disappeared. The second door opened and another person walked out. His appearance was a bit different from the first person, but there were also some similarities. He still didn't have any expression, but his eyes carried an extremely sharp glint. He tightly gripped a red longsword and quickly rushed towards Chu Mu. The sword slashed down. A golden light flashed on the blade, and Chu Mu felt an astonishing sharpness. It was the power of the law of metal. The slash of the sword seemed to be able to split a mountain in half. Its power was clearly stronger than the first opponent. Chapter 995. On the first level of the heaven-sundering sword pagoda, doors opened one after another. One after another, opponents died under Chu Mu's sword. These opponents were all at the first firmament of creation realm, but each one was stronger than the last. Their attacks were very fierce, but they did not use any sword skills. They fought with Chu Mu purely with their sword skills. Chu Mu's attainments in sword skills were extremely high. Using sword skills to fight with him was simply courting death. As expected, even the opponent who walked out of the eighth door died under Chu Mu's dodging and counterattack. A ray of light fell from the sky and enveloped Chu Mu. It was like a guiding light that allowed Chu Mu to fly up and reach the second level of the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. There were still 8 doors on the second level of the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. The opponents on the second level should be stronger than those on the first level. Chu Mu thought to himself. He realized that he had not recovered the sword origin and other things he had used up during the battle on the first level. Fortunately, he had not used much of them. The strength of the opponents on the second level had not appeared yet, so Chu Mu had no idea. Second firmament of creation realm? The answer was revealed. The first door opened and a person walked out. It was his first opponent. The aura he emitted allowed Chu Mu to know that this opponent's cultivation was at the first firmament of creation realm. However, his cultivation was much stronger than those on the first level. Moreover, this opponent had a flexible aura that carried a fierce aura, like an unsheathed sword. As soon as he walked out of the open door, this opponent's footsteps were very fast. He turned into a ray of light and charged towards Chu Mu. He raised his sword and an extremely fierce aura erupted. The blue sword light was like a storm that poured down on Chu Mu. The moment he attacked, he used a sword skill. The fluctuations told Chu Mu that this was a first-grade earth rank water sword skill that had reached the high level. In other words, his opponent's law of water was at the earth rank and was at the low level of the earth rank. The rainstorm sword technique attacked. Every point was like a sword shadow that poured down in torrents, as though wanting to pierce Chu Mu into a hornet's nest. Chu Mu was able to see through his opponent's strength with a single glance. The weakness of this sword skill also appeared in his mind. He didn't even need to use a sword skill. He only needed to activate his sword origin, infusing it with the inextinguishable sword intent and the law of metal. His sword was dyed golden as he followed the weakness and slashed out. In an instant, the blue rainstorm quickly melted like snow under the scorching sun. Chu Mu's sword was like an arc of light from the heavens, chopping towards his opponent's neck without slowing down. A trace of astonishment flashed through his opponent's eyes. Astonishment became the last expression in his eyes. The corpse and blood disappeared. The second door opened, and a second opponent appeared. This opponent's cultivation was also at the first heaven of the creation realm. The law he used was the law of wind, which was at the low level of the earth rank. The moment he attacked, it was still a sword skill. A green wind blew, and the sword light was faintly discernible in the wind. It was astonishingly sharp, and its power seemed to have increased by 2 notches. Even so, he was still not Chu Mu's opponent. He saw through the weakness at a glance and slashed out with his sword, defeating the wind and killing his opponent. The next 6 doors opened one by one, and opponents appeared one after another. Their cultivation was also at the first heaven of the creation realm, but the law they used was at a higher level. The 3rd and 4th opponents' law power had reached the middle level of the earth rank. The 5th and 6th opponents' law power had reached the high level of the earth rank. The 7th and 8th opponents' law power had reached the top level of the earth rank. It was not only the increase in the level of the law power. Although the sword skills they used were also at the first level of the earth rank, their power gradually increased. In the battle with the 8th opponent, he could no longer kill his opponent with one strike, so he had to use his sword skills. The energy consumed by being teleported to the 3rd floor of the sword pagoda had not recovered. There were still 8 doors on the 3rd floor, and 8 opponents would appear. However, Chu Mu did not know the strength of the opponents this time. However, according to the situation on the 2nd floor, Chu Mu guessed that the 8 opponents on the 3rd floor might still be at the first heaven of the creation realm, but the law power they had mastered would be at a higher level, such as the heaven rank. Correspondingly, their king-level sword essence would also reach the same level as the law power. As for whether his guess was true, he would soon find out. When the first door opened, before Chu Mu could take a closer look, a figure rushed out like lightning. The man and the sword became one, and the sword slashed out. The sword was like thunder, with rolling thunder, and its power was amazing. Chu Mu immediately knew that the opponent's cultivation was indeed at the first heaven of the creation realm, and the king-level sword essence and the law power he used were indeed at the low level of the heaven rank. The sword's skill was like thunder, and it wanted to destroy everything. Chu Mu's eyes were sharp, and he captured the trajectory of the sword. He moved and dodged and counterattacked with a sword skill. The sword skill under the top level of the heaven rank king level inextinguishable sword essence and the top level of the heaven rank gold law was extremely powerful. The sword cut off the opponent's thunder, and it was unstoppable. It directly cut off the opponent's neck, and his head flew into the air. Soon, the 2nd door opened, and a figure rushed out at an even faster speed. However, it did not directly attack Chu Mu. Instead, it circled Chu Mu at high speed, forming afterimages. In an instant, countless afterimages clasped the sharp sword in their hands, and all of them rushed towards Chu Mu from all directions, with Chu Mu as the central target. This was another sword skill, and it was hard to tell whether it was real or fake. However, it was just an Earth rank first-grade Earth rank sword skill, and it could not really disturb Chu Mu's judgment. Chu Mu closed his eyes, and he raised his listening to the sword and touching the sword to the extreme. All the air fluctuations around him were clearly felt by Chu Mu. Among the countless figures, there must be one that was real, and the rest were all fake. The fake figures were afterimages created by the real body using high speed. Even if they attacked Chu Mu, they were fake, and it was a kind of visual deception. Because they were fake and illusory, they would not cause the air to fluctuate. Only the real body would cause the air to fluctuate. Under Chu Mu's touching the sword, even the slightest fluctuation in the air could be clearly felt. He drew his sword, and his sword skill broke the wind. The green wind blade instantly tore through the sky, and slashed towards the opponent, cutting him in half. The opponent's face had a trace of astonishment, and there was uncertainty in his eyes, as if he did not understand how he was discovered and killed in a single strike. The 3rd door opened, and the 3rd opponent appeared. This opponent's rule force had reached the mid-level of the heaven rank, and it was getting stronger and stronger. However, Chu Mu was even stronger, and he killed the opponent once again. The 4th opponent was killed. The 5th opponent's rule force had reached the high level of the heaven rank, and he was also killed by Chu Mu. However, this time, Chu Mu did not kill him in one move, unless he used his god rank rule force. The 6th opponent was killed. The 7th and 8th opponent's rule force had reached the top level of the heaven rank, which was the same level as Chu Mu's. The level of the sword intent was also the same as Chu Mu's. However, Chu Mu's sword intent was an attribute sword intent, and it was the top indestructible attribute among the attribute sword intents. Its power was much stronger than the opponent's ordinary sword intent. Killed. In the battle on the third floor, Chu Mu's sword origin and divine sense were obviously consumed. The power appeared again, and Chu Mu appeared on the fourth floor, shrouded in light. The fourth floor looked similar to the first 3 floors, and there were still 8 doors. The first door opened, and Chu Mu's first opponent strode out. Chu Mu was stunned, because he found that this opponent was exactly the same as the first opponent on the first floor. However, this opponent's aura was much stronger than the first opponent on the first floor. His cultivation was at the second heaven of the Fate realm. He attacked, and a sword light flashed in front of his eyes. A water dragon roared, and a cool breeze blew. The sword light was restrained in the wind, and the killing intent was looming. As soon as he attacked, he first used a water sword technique, followed by a wind sword technique, attacking Chu Mu from the front and back. Immediately after, as the sword flashed, there was the angry roar of the wind and the roar of the water, forming a water tornado, majestically sweeping towards Chu Mu. It was a sword technique that integrated wind and water. Chu Mu was surprised by the opponent's move. Fortunately, this opponent's rule force was only at the low level of the mortal rank. However, the power of a 2-star sword of Gojoseon's second-grade mortal rank sword technique was not something that an ordinary Ichino sword of Gojoseon could resist. For example, Wang Wei's Ichino sword of Gojoseon, even though his rule force had reached the top level of the heaven rank. However, to Chu Mu, this opponent only made him feel surprised. He dodged, found flaws, and counterattacked with his sword. He used the fiercest attack to kill his opponent. After each battle, the power that was consumed could not be recovered. Therefore, Chu Mu paid more attention to the rhythm and style of the battle. He wanted to save his power and kill his opponent with the least cost. The 8th opponent on the 4th floor was at the second heaven of the Fate realm. As soon as he attacked, he used 3 consecutive sword techniques. His rule force had reached the top level of the mortal rank, and its power was much stronger than the first opponent. Chu Mu fought with him for a while, and then successfully killed him. After entering the 5th floor, Chu Mu had used up more than half of his sword energy after continuous battles. The first opponent on the 5th floor appeared. He was at the second heaven of the Fate realm, and his 2 rule forces had both reached the low level of the earth rank. As soon as he attacked, he used a powerful sword technique. First, it was a first-grade sword technique, then a second-grade sword technique. He used all his strength and attacked Chu Mu as if he was his enemy. The 2-star sword of Gojoseon's second-grade earth rank sword technique was much more powerful than the Ichino sword of Gojoseon's first-grade earth rank sword technique. If Chu Mu was just an ordinary Ichino sword of Gojoseon, he would not even be able to pass the first 3 floors. It was no wonder that Wang Wei did not want to challenge him. Only by passing the first 3 floors would he have a chance to get the reward. The higher the floors, the better the reward. The 3rd opponent on the 4th floor appeared. This opponent's strength had increased and was even more powerful. The 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th opponent appeared. Chapter 996. Outside the heaven-sundering sword pagoda, Wang Wei's face was filled with astonishment. Chu Mu had been in there for quite some time, but he still hadn't come out. Could it be that he could really obtain the sacred sword? Actually, from the beginning, Wang Wei didn't think that Chu Mu could succeed in the challenge. This was because he knew the challenge rules of the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. Every floor had 8 opponents, and the opponents from the 1st to the 3rd floor had the same cultivation as him. They had only grasped one type of power of law, but their level would continuously increase from low to high. Their battle prowess would also increase along with their strength. The opponents from the 4th to the 6th floor had a cultivation that was one level higher than him. They had grasped two types of power of law and could fuse them together. Their battle prowess would increase and their strength would increase. The opponents from the 7th to the 9th floor had a cultivation that was 2 levels higher than him. They had grasped 3 types of power of law and could fuse them together. Their battle prowess would increase and their strength would increase. And to succeed in the challenge, one would have to at least pass the 3rd floor. Wang Wei guessed that Chu Mu, a mere new sword of Gojoseon, had not yet grasped the sword technique, so it was impossible for him to pass the 3rd floor. What he didn't know was that on the 5th floor of the heaven-sundering sword pagoda, Chu Mu was fighting with his 8th opponent. The 8th opponent on the 5th floor had a cultivation at the 2nd layer of the creation realm. He had grasped 2 types of power of law and had reached the peak of the earth realm. The moment he attacked, he alternated between using an Earth Tier 1 advanced sword technique and an Earth Tier 2 advanced sword technique. His power was even more tyrannical. His sword techniques weaved in and out, sometimes close and sometimes far. It was very difficult to deal with. This was a powerful 2-star sword of Gojoseon. He was much stronger than the 2-star sword of Gojoseon that Chu Mu had killed before. He was a difficult opponent to deal with. Chu Mu kept dodging. Because he had gone through a series of battles, his divine sense and sword energy had been greatly depleted. He didn't have much left. What left them speechless was that they couldn't consume recovery pills within the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. They couldn't rely on their own recovery speed to keep up with their recovery speed. Until now, his remaining sword energy and divine sense were only enough to perform 1 Earth rank 2nd stage Earth breaking sword skill or 1 Earth rank 1st stage heaven shocking sword skill. His opponent's attacks were like a torrential storm, tireless and endless. Alternating between sword arts and sword skills, it was extremely difficult to deal with. Chu Mu was looking for an opportunity. The opponents of the heaven-cleaving sword pagoda were each stronger and more complete than the last. Chu Mu found it difficult to find an opening in this opponent's attack. Even if he did find one, it would be fleeting and difficult to grasp. If Chu Mu was still at the peak of the divine condensation realm and his opponent was also at the peak of the divine condensation realm, then even if his opponent's sword origin was several times denser than Chu Mu's, Chu Mu would still be able to defeat him in a few moves. However, he was now at the manifestation realm. This was a new realm, the starting point of an expert. Chu Mu was temporarily unable to use many of the powers that he had grasped. He was unable to erupt with his most powerful form. Dodging, dodging, dodging. His brain never stopped working. His thoughts spun rapidly as he calculated and simulated. In the end, Chu Mu grasped an instant of opportunity. His opponent's sword was like the last rays of the setting sun, its afterglow desolate yet magnificent. As it danced, the world seemed to end. Chu Mu's moving body suddenly stopped. Once his sword struck out, there was no turning back. He slashed out, struck out, and activated the mountain-shaking force. The powerful vibrational force blasted his opponent's sword away. With a flick of his wrist, the sword that had been bent due to the collision instantly straightened. Driven by the powerful force, he slashed out. Azure and gold intertwined as the sword's skill, Wind Cutter, was activated. With a slash, as if lightning had streaked across the sky, his opponent's body was cleaved in half by Chu Mu's sword, from head to hip. Chu Mu's left arm had also been pierced by his opponent's sword, leaving behind a bloody hole. Injuries were unavoidable. This was also the best way for Chu Mu to kill his opponent after many simulations and calculations. Although it had been a long time since he had been injured like this, Chu Mu's expression did not change. It was as if the arm that had been pierced was not his. Feeling the sword origin within his body and the spiritual sense within his spiritual world, he found that there was not much left. If he entered the 6th floor, he might not even be able to defeat his first opponent. Thinking of this, Chu Mu spoke, ending the challenge. The heaven-sundering sword pagoda seemed to have a spirit and was able to understand Chu Mu's meaning. The wound on his arm healed under the power of the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. The sword origin and spiritual sense that he had used up were also quickly recovered. Immediately after, Chu Mu's surroundings changed. It was complete darkness. Suddenly, rays of light appeared from the void. They were rays of sword light one after another. There were a total of 9 sword light. They revolved around Chu Mu's body and spun at a high speed. They spun faster and faster, and Chu Mu's eyes could not distinguish them. Chu Mu did not understand the situation. He only looked at the sword light that was spinning at such a high speed that even his spiritual sense could not distinguish them. He subconsciously shouted, "Stop!" Suddenly, the sword light that was spinning at such a high speed seemed to have a mind of its own and began to slow down. Finally, one of the 9 sword lights stopped right in front of Chu Mu. The other 8 sword light disappeared into the void one after another, returning to nothingness and disappearing. Could this be the sacred sword that I obtained? He stared at the sword that was floating in front of him. It was an ancient sword that was about the same length as the Sword of Return. It was light purple in color, and there were white arcs of electricity leaping around the sword. They formed a single entity like a bolt of white lightning. The white lightning emitted a tyrannical power, and there seemed to be crackling sounds. He reached out and grabbed the sword hilt. Suddenly, the white arcs of electricity gathered into a bolt of lightning and blasted towards Chu Mu's palm, as if it was resisting. A mere lower-grade sacred sword. His eyes shone with a sharp light. The law of lightning was activated, and he ignored the white lightning. He gripped the ancient sword's hilt tightly, preventing it from escaping. The lower-grade sacred sword struggled a few times, but it was unable to move. It seemed to understand that it was powerless to resist. Its master was very powerful, and he was qualified to own it. Violent Thunder. This name is quite imposing. The white lightning on the ancient sword receded, revealing 2 ancient words on the ancient sword. They were the words Violent Thunder, the sword's name. Chu Mu had killed a few sword of Gojoseon before, and he had obtained their sacred swords. The power of a sacred sword wasn't something an emperor-grade sword could compare to. The difference between each grade was very obvious. A lower-grade sword of Gojoseon was suitable for a lower-grade sacred sword. Only then could it unleash its full power. A middle-grade sword of Gojoseon was suitable for a middle-grade sacred sword, and a high-grade sword of Gojoseon was suitable for a high-grade sacred sword. Although there were several sacred swords in the interspatial ring, there were lower-grade, middle-grade, and high-grade sacred swords, but middle-grade and high-grade sacred swords weren't suitable. Those few lower-grade sacred swords were just ordinary lower-grade sacred sword. They couldn't be compared to Violent Thunder. Although the Violent Thunder sacred sword was a lower-grade sacred sword, it was the best among the lower-grade sacred swords. The moment the Violent Thunder sacred sword submitted to Chu Mu knew where the power of the Violent Thunder sacred sword lay. It doubled the might of the Law of Lightning. The Law of Lightning was already very powerful, and it was obvious that the doubled might would be more tyrannical. Sword skills that were integrated with the Law of Lightning would also be affected, and their might would increase. You will be following me for a period of time. Chu Mu raised the Violent Thunder sacred sword and said. In an instant, a scabbard appeared and wrapped itself around the Violent Thunder sacred sword. Carrying the Violent Thunder sacred sword, Chu Mu's figure faded, and he appeared outside the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. He's out. Wang Wei's gaze was suddenly attracted, and his pupils rapidly shrank. He stared at the sword in the light purple scabbard in Chu Mu's left hand. The sharp aura emitted from the sword let him know that it was a sacred sword. I remember that he didn't carry a sword when he went in. Wang Wei's thoughts raced. For a moment, he couldn't tell whether the sword in Chu Mu's left hand was taken from the interspatial ring or a reward from the heaven-sundering sword pagoda. Although the value of a sacred sword wasn't low, it was still possible to get one if one wanted to. However, The light purple sacred sword in Chu Mu's hand gave off an extraordinary feeling. Seeing Chu Mu turn around and walk over, Wang Wei took a few steps forward and hurriedly said, "Junior brother Chu, you're out. This sword." He pointed at the ancient sword in Chu Mu's hand. "Take a guess." Seeing the curiosity in Wang Wei's eyes, Chu Mu suddenly smiled mischievously and said 2 words. Wang Wei almost went berserk, but when he thought about his own strength and estimated that he was inferior to Chu Mu, he could only smile awkwardly. After obtaining a suitable sword, Chu Mu was in a good mood. Under Wang Wei's lead, he registered his identity and obtained the right to live in the Sword Pagoda. This meant that from now on, Chu Mu was a disciple of the Heaven Sundering Academy. Along the way, Wang Wei did everything he could to ask Chu Mu about the origin of the ancient sword in his hand. This wasn't a secret, so Chu Mu simply told him that he obtained the ancient sword after challenging the Heaven Sundering Sword Pagoda. For a moment, Wang Wei's heart was in turmoil. It had to be known that Chu Mu was the same as him. They had both just broken through to the Blessed Realm and had just become a Sword of Gojoseon. Wang Wei originally thought that everyone had just become a Sword of Gojoseon and that it was a new beginning. No matter how strong Chu Mu was, he wouldn't be much weaker than him. But now, it seemed that his thoughts were wrong. Chu Mu's strength definitely far surpassed his. Even Lu Yi couldn't compare to him. Perhaps even senior brother Tsang Mo couldn't compare to Chu Mu. Wang Wei quickly left to look for Lu Yi and Tsang Mo. He planned to tell them that Chu Mu had become a Sword of Gojoseon and had successfully challenged the Heaven Sundering Sword Pagoda and obtained a sacred sword as a reward. Chu Mu didn't know what Wang Wei was thinking. The Sword Pagoda he obtained stood beside the lake. The lake water was blue, and it reflected the blue sky and white clouds of the small world. It had a unique flavor. The Heaven Sundering Academy's valley was much larger than the sky-soaring academies. The distance between the Sword Pagoda was very far. At the very least, there was no other Sword Pagoda within a radius of 10,000 meters. Facing the blue lake water that was several thousand meters wide, Chu Mu's sword was like a white thunderbolt that split the air. A sword ray wrapped in white thunderbolts instantly shot into the lake in the distance. When it landed, the lake water burst out and splashed dozens of meters. Each drop contained the power of white thunderbolts, and it was extremely tyrannical. After a few more slashes, Chu Mu stood beside the lake and tried to use the ancient sword. Chapter 997. A gust of wind blew past the several thousand meters wide lake, causing the blue lake water to ripple. The ripples spread out, shattering the reflection of the blue sky and the white clouds. A figure instantly shot out from the sword tower beside the lake with extreme speed. In just an instant, he appeared in the middle of the lake and brandished his sword. The sword disappeared and turned into a bolt of lightning, slashing out in Chu Mu's hand. His feet stepped on the surface of the lake as he stood on the wave. The sword he swung out had the momentum of a thunderbolt. Every sword was swift and fierce. Every sword strike was like a thunderbolt striking down, splashing up countless amounts of blue lake water, creating a multicolored scene. Suddenly, Chu Mu turned around and soared into the sky. He looked down and slashed down with the violent thunder sacred sword in his hand. A cracking sound rang out, and in an instant, it was as if a bolt of lightning had struck down from the sky and struck the surface of the blue lake. In an instant, dozens of meters of lake water exploded and surged into the sky before falling back down. Countless white arcs of electricity swam across the surface of the lake. One strike after another, each strike was accompanied by a bolt of lightning. White bolts of lightning fell from the sky like a thunderstorm from the 9 heavens. The blue water of the lake, which was thousands of meters wide, kept exploding. The powerful aura turned into layers of turbulent waves that surged out in all directions. After dozens of strikes, the entire lake seemed to have turned into a small ocean. The waves were endless and countless blazing white arcs of lightning flickered crazily. It was like a sea of lightning arcs. Sheathing his sword, Chu Mu stood in the air. The lightning on the violent thunder sacred sword was restrained. He looked down at the blue lake water waves that were mixed with the white lightning bolts, and a smile appeared on his face. So far, he had successfully transformed 5 types of laws: the law of space, the law of metal, the law of wind, the law of thunder, and the law of water. His mastery of the law of metal and the law of wind was the deepest. He already had a sword skill each, and he could even perform a second-grade sword skill with the law of metal and wind. It would take at least a year to master the other 3 laws to the level of a sword skill. However, with the violent thunder sacred sword, it could double the power of the law of thunder, allowing Chu Mu to release the power of the law of thunder. The power of the law of thunder combined with the sword origin and undying sword intent was even greater than before, only second to a first-grade sword skill. If it was in battle, it could also be quite useful, although it could not be compared to chop tie and break wind. Apart from doubling the power of the law of thunder, I feel that the efficiency of comprehending the law of thunder with the violent thunder sacred sword has doubled, Chu Mu thought. Sure enough, the best sacred sword of the same level was extraordinary. If he had casually taken out a low-grade sacred sword from his space ring, it would definitely not have such power. In fact, the challenge of the heaven-splitting sword pagoda was not easy. It could even be said to be difficult. Think about it, if a person with a cultivation of the first heavenly layer of creation entered the challenge, the opponents from the first to the 3rd floor would have the same cultivation as him. The opponents from the 4th to the 6th floor would have the cultivation of the 2nd heavenly layer of creation, and the opponents from the 7th to the 9th floor would have the cultivation of the 3rd heavenly layer of creation. The difference in strength between each heavenly layer was at least 10 times, and it was very obvious. Coupled with the continuous increase in level and quantity of the law of thunder, as well as the continuous improvement of the opponent's combat experience, combat skills, and control of sword skills, one's strength would increase step by step. Once the challenger was injured or exhausted, they could not use medicinal pills to heal and recover. They could only rely on their own recovery speed. As one side grew weaker and the other side grew stronger, one's strength would become weaker and weaker as they faced stronger and stronger opponents. In the end, they would not be able to resist at all. After careful analysis, one would understand that challenging the heaven-splitting sword pagoda and obtaining the sacred sword was not a simple matter. Among the current disciples of the Heaven-Splitting Academy, Chu Mu did not know how many people had obtained the sacred sword by challenging the heaven-splitting sword pagoda, but he guessed that there should not be many. The blue lake returned to its calm state. Just as Chu Mu was about to return to the sword pagoda, he felt a swift and fierce aura rapidly approaching. He raised his head and saw 2 sword light appear in front of him. In the blink of an eye, they were rapidly approaching. These 2 swift and fierce auras swept across the sky and locked onto Chu Mu. Chu Mu immediately understood that they were coming for him. However, he had only been in the Heaven-Splitting Academy for a few days. Who would come looking for him? The answer was revealed. The 2 sword light stopped a few dozen meters in front of him. An incomparably swift and fierce aura directly impacted his body. The fierce sword-like wind brought by the sword light also bombarded him with an unstoppable force. Even the air around him was moved, and the lake below was buffeted by the fierce wind, causing waves to surge violently. Its power was astonishing. Chu Mu frowned. He felt that these people did not come with good intentions. The aura contained in these 2 sword light was very powerful. Their cultivation had reached the 2nd heavenly layer of Fortune Realm. The sword light retracted, revealing 2 figures. They were 2 men who looked to be in their 30s. One had a dark complexion, while the other had a thin face. They had different appearances, but their fierce gazes locked onto Chu Mu. One of them had a golden light, while the other had a green light. "Senior brothers, what can I do for you?" Chu Mu asked indifferently. It was obvious that they had come for him. As for why he called them senior brothers, it was only because their cultivation was higher than his. They had definitely entered the heaven-splitting academy earlier than him. Since you know that we are your senior brothers, then shouldn't junior brother do his best to help if senior brother has a problem? The thin swordsman said with a smile that was not a smile. Senior brother, if you have something to say, why don't you say it? Chu Mu said indifferently. He increasingly felt that these people did not come with good intentions. It's not a big deal. For junior brother, it's still a good thing, the dark swordsman said. Chu Mu did not say anything. I heard that you challenged the heaven-splitting sword pagoda and successfully passed the third floor's challenge. You obtained a low-grade saint sword. The dark swordsman continued, your low-grade saint sword is a lightning-attributed saint sword, right? Brother Gung mainly cultivates the law of lightning. He just happened to need a lightning-attributed saint sword. He heard that you had one, so he asked us to come and buy it. Chu Mu was slightly taken aback. He had not thought of this. However, this violent thunder saint sword was very handy for him. He was very satisfied with it. How could he give it to someone else? An ordinary low-grade saint sword outside is worth 1,000,000 high-grade origin crystals. Your lightning-attributed saint sword is even more outstanding than ordinary low-grade saint sword. Brother Gung is a very righteous person. He specially gave us 1,500,000 high-grade origin crystals to buy this sword. How is it? Not bad, right? 1,500,000 high-grade origin crystals is not a small fortune for you, the skinny swordsman said with a smile. 1,500,000. A playful smile flashed across Chu Mu's face. Indeed, an ordinary low-grade saint sword was worth about 1,000,000 high-grade origin crystals. Violent Thunder Saint Sword was the best of the high-grade saint swords. It could double the power of the law of lightning, and could also help one to control the law of lightning. Its value was not something that could be bought with 2,000,000 high-grade origin crystals. It would be at least 3,000,000. If it was sold at an auction, it might be even higher. The Violent Thunder Saint Sword was worth at least 3,000,000 high-grade origin crystals. The other party actually wanted to buy it for 1,500,000 high-grade origin crystals. It was simply laughable. Fixed price, 5,000,000, Chu Mu said unhurriedly. What? 5,000,000 high-grade origin crystals? The two swordsmen at the second layer of Fortune Realm were stunned. They then exclaimed loudly. Soon after, their faces became gloomy. They stared at Chu Mu with dark eyes and said in a deep voice, looking at junior brother's appearance, you don't plan to earn 1,500,000 high-grade origin crystals. Junior brother has just become a disciple of the Heaven-Breaking Hall. You still don't know the situation of the Heaven-Breaking Hall, right? The gray-faced swordsman's face was gloomy as if it was smeared with a layer of pot-bottom ash. He said to Chu Mu in a threatening tone, being able to pass the challenge of the Heaven-Breaking Sword Pagoda means that your talent is not bad. Your future achievements will not be low. However, there are many people stronger than you. It will be beneficial for you to get to know some people. Don't delay your path. 5,000,000 fixed price. Chu Mu repeated as if he would not get it no matter how hard he tried. You. A mouthful of anger surged from the bottom of their hearts. The two were furious. Junior brother, don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. They threatened again. Senior brothers, please. Chu Mu smiled faintly. He did not care about the other party's threat. I'll say one last thing. This sword is not what we want. It's what Brother Gung wants. You'd better ask around about Brother Gung's name. Since Brother Gung wants the sword, then let him come and get it himself, Chu Mu said indifferently. You. Very good. You really have a backbone. I hope you won't regret it when the time comes. After the two glared at Chu Mu, they angrily left behind these words. They snorted coldly and turned to leave. Chu Mu could see that before the two turned around, they hesitated. They wondered if they should make a move. However, perhaps because they were worried about the rules of the Flying Heaven Pavilion, or perhaps because they did not have much confidence, they did not make a move. Brother Gung. Chu Mu's lips curled into a smile. If this Brother Gung wanted his low-grade holy sword, then it was very likely that he was a low-grade sword of Gojosian, probably at the level of the Samsung sword of Gojosian. If it was above the level of a low-grade sword of Gojosian, then this wild thunder sacred sword would not be of much use. Of course, it was also possible that this Brother Gung wanted his wild thunder sacred sword and planned to give it to someone else. However, based on the words of the two swordsmen, it was likely that this Brother Gung wanted it more for himself. Third Heaven of Creation. Samsung Sword of Gojosian. Chu Mu was not afraid of the Samsung Sword of Gojosian's strength. If he really wanted to fight, he could just use the Divine Wilderness Sword Art and Deshang's Burning Blood transformation to increase his strength rapidly. He might not be a match for the other party. Chu Mu was never afraid of a challenge. After putting this matter aside, he turned around and turned into a stream of light. In the blink of an eye, he entered the sword tower by the lake. He did not rest. Instead, he practiced a sword technique, the lightning sword technique. When he used the wild thunder sacred sword to perform the lightning sword technique and drive the lightning sword technique, a unique sense of familiarity surged into his mind. The efficiency was much higher. Chu Mu estimated that he would be able to grasp the lightning sword technique again in about half a year. Chapter 998. He really said that? A middle-aged swordsman in a purple robe casually asked as he looked at the setting sun with his hands behind his back. Yes, Senior Brother Gung, this Chu Mu thinks he has some talent and looks down on everything. His eyes are above his head, and he simply doesn't put Senior Brother Gung in his eyes. The ash-faced swordsman said in an exaggerated tone. Brother Gung, this Chu Mu doesn't know what's good for him. He should be taught a lesson. The skinny swordsman said. He should be taught a lesson, but it depends on how. Alright, you can go back first. The middle-aged swordsman in purple robe said slowly. Yes, Brother Gung. We'll take our leave first. The two swordsmen looked at each other and turned to leave as they discussed secretly. Looks like Senior Brother Gung plans to wait until his wounds are healed before attacking. He wants to teach Chu Mu a lesson and make him remember. Yes, this Chu Mu's luck is not bad. He can be free for a few more days. Senior Brother Gung's matter was quickly thrown to the back of Chu Mu's mind. To him, it was a small matter. Holding tightly to the wild thunder sacred sword, he would practice lightning sword techniques in the lake every time. He gradually familiarized himself with the rules of lightning, and he did not neglect the rules of gold and wind that he had already mastered. Other than practicing sword techniques, he also practiced the Heavenly Desolate Sword Manual every day. Before the creation realm, the difference in sword energy between each level was not that great. It was at most 2 to 3 times, but after the creation realm, the difference between each level was at least 10 times. It was very obvious. Therefore, increasing one's cultivation was also a method to increase one's strength. The secret technique, Pupils of the Sword, the Divine Desolate Sword Manual, the 4th level of the Heavenly Desolate Sword Body, and so on all required Chu Mu's time. His schedule was packed to the brim every day. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. In the sword tower, Chu Mu opened his eyes and opened his mouth slightly. He exhaled a white breath that shot into the sky like a sword, causing the air to emit a sharp whistle as if it was being torn apart. The effect of using Yuan liquid to cultivate is indeed very obvious. Chu Mu muttered to himself in a voice that only he could hear. Ordinary Sword of Gojosian did not have the capital to use Yuan liquid to cultivate because it was very difficult to extract Yuan liquid. Only those disciples that were heavily nurtured by large forces could frequently use Yuan liquid to cultivate. Chu Mu's Yuan liquid was found in the space ring of a Sword of Gojosian in the land of 5 elements. There was only a total of 5 kilograms. The other Sword of Gojosian did not have it. But no matter what, it was enough to show how precious Yuan liquid was. I used a full day to completely refine half a kilogram of Yuan liquid. My cultivation has already completely consolidated at the first layer of the creation stage. If I completely refine the remaining 9 kilograms of Yuan liquid, my cultivation will very likely reach the peak of the first layer of the creation stage, and I will be able to break through to the second layer of the creation stage. Chu Mu secretly estimated. However, half a kilogram of Yuan liquid would take a day. 10 kilograms of Yuan liquid would take 10 days. Moreover, after refining half a kilogram of Yuan liquid, he would need to use some time to repeatedly move the sword energy and familiarize himself with the sword energy before consuming the Yuan liquid again. In this way, the time needed to refine the 5 kilograms of Yuan liquid would naturally be greatly extended. The energy of half a kilogram of Yuan liquid was equivalent to the energy contained in 10,000 top-grade Yuan crystals. There was not the slightest trace of impurities in it, and it could be easily refined. This caused the actual value of half a kilogram of Yuan liquid to exceed 10,000 top-grade Yuan crystals. What made Yuan liquid even more precious was that an ordinary sword of Gojoseon would not be able to buy it anywhere. Today, after finishing his cultivation, Chu Mu received a sword token. The token was jade-colored and there were scratches on it as if they had been carved out by a sword. There were 3 words on it: Heavenly Sword Hall. On the back was an ancient sword that pierced through the clouds. Heavenly Sword Hall? Looking at the jade-colored sword token in his hand, Chu Mu was surprised. Then, the jade-colored sword token in his hand trembled slightly. A dense jade-colored light burst out of the token and condensed into a jade-colored shadow. Chu Mu felt that he was being watched. Chu Mu, please come to the West Tiger Sword Shrine for the soldier assessment and contribute to the human race. The shadow said very directly. Then, it dispersed and rushed into the jade-colored sword token. The jade-colored sword token returned to normal. West Tiger Sword Shrine? Chu Mu pondered. He left the sword tower and went to the library to look for related books and read them. I see. After reading, Chu Mu understood that after a genius swordsman broke through and became a sword of Gojoseon, they would often receive an invitation from the Heavenly Sword Hall to register and apply for the soldier assessment. The human race was led by the Heavenly Sword Hall, the Underworld God Clan was led by the Underworld God Hall, the Earth Demon Clan was led by the Demon God Hall, and the Heavenly Demon Clan was led by the Demon God Hall. Simply put, each of the 100 races of the Archean world was led by their own temple. Among the 100 races of the Archean world, there were alliances and enemies. Naturally, the situation between the temples was the same. Regardless of the race, when they reached the King Realm, they would often receive an invitation from their own temple. Of course, those in remote territories were an exception. After all, they were too far away from the temple. Receiving an invitation from the Heavenly Sword Hall did not mean that one had to follow it. It depended on one's wishes. However, if a swordsman wanted to continue on the path of swordsmanship, he would most likely have to accept an invitation from the Heavenly Sword Hall. A true expert was killed between life and death, not nurtured in a greenhouse. After understanding through the books, Chu Mu decided to accept the invitation from the Heavenly Sword Hall and go to the Heavenly Sword Hall. After a little tidying up, Chu Mu immediately set off. He left the heaven-breaking courtyard and the flying heaven pavilion. Once again, he came to the West Tiger territory and quickly flew in the direction of the West Tiger Sword Shrine. Every year, many swordsmen in the West Tiger territory would successfully break through and become a sword of Gojoseon. Although it was not easy to become a sword of Gojoseon, the West Tiger territory was very large and had a large population. Moreover, there were many sword of Gojoseon from other territories. In the sky above the West Tiger territory, clouds floated for thousands of miles. A huge palace was hidden deep within, faintly discernible. Occasionally, a corner of the palace would be revealed. Only then would one understand how huge and incomparable this palace was. Streaks of light flew over from the distance, straight into the sky, towards the palace that stood on top of an incomparably huge expanse of white clouds, shrouded by thousands of miles of floating clouds. This palace in the clouds was the branch of the Heavenly Sword Hall in the West Tiger Territory, the West Tiger Sword Shrine. After spending several months, Chu Mu finally arrived at the West Tiger Sword Shrine from the Flying Heaven Pavilion. Standing on top of the clouds, before him was an incomparably huge and magnificent palace. It towered into the clouds and was as majestic as a mountain. It seemed to have existed since time immemorial. Chu Mu was momentarily absent-minded. He was shocked by the grandeur of this palace. Like Chu Mu, many other Sword of Gojosian were also shocked by the palace in front of them. Although it's not the first time I've seen the Heavenly Sword Hall, I'm still shocked every time I see it, a Sword of Gojosian said in a low voice not far away. Then, he strode towards the open door of the Heavenly Sword Hall. One after another, Sword of Gojosian flew onto the clouds and landed outside the door of the Heavenly Sword Hall. They paused for a moment because they were shocked. Then, they walked into the Heavenly Sword Hall. Chu Mu discovered that some of these Sword of Gojosian's cultivation had surpassed the first heavenly layer of creation. They had reached the second heavenly layer or even the third heavenly layer. There were also some whose auras were obscure and powerful. It was obvious that they had surpassed the third heavenly layer and had reached a higher level. He even saw one or two Sword of Gojosian. Their auras were like the abyss and extremely terrifying. They were definitely high-level Sword of Gojosian. He collected his thoughts and regained his composure. He strode towards the open door of the Heavenly Sword Hall and walked in. The palace behind the door of the Heavenly Sword Hall was extremely large. There were a large number of tables and chairs. Many people were sitting around the tables, chatting, drinking, and so on. Chu Mu's arrival did not attract their attention. Only a few people faced the door and casually glanced at him. A Sword of Gojosian like Chu Mu, who was at the first heavenly layer of creation, was very common in their eyes. There was nothing strange about it. After Chu Mu glanced around, he suddenly saw a familiar figure. At the same time, that person also looked over. When he saw Chu Mu, he was slightly stunned at first. Then, he revealed a smile and waved at Chu Mu, gesturing for him to come over. "Junior brother Chu, I didn't expect you to have already broken through and become a Sword of Gojosian. Congratulations." After Chu Mu approached, the person stood up and smiled at Chu Mu. His tone was sincere, which surprised the two people at the same table. They could not help but look at Chu Mu and size him up carefully. They found that Chu Mu was only at the first heavenly layer of creation, and he looked like he had just consolidated it. They could not help but feel surprised. "Greetings, Senior Brother Qin. If it weren't for the spirit medicine that Senior Brother Qin gave me back then, it would have been difficult for me to break through to the creation realm," Chu Mu said as he saluted with his sword. The person was the chief disciple of the heaven-breaking courtyard in the Flying Heaven Pavilion, Qin Tianyi. A hint of understanding flashed across the faces of the two people at the same table as Qin Tianyi, and they looked at Chu Mu with disdain. They had originally thought that a person who could be greeted so warmly by Qin Tianyi would definitely be someone extraordinary. However, when they saw that he was only at the first heavenly layer of creation, they secretly guessed. After hearing Chu Mu's words, they realized that this person was only able to break through because of the spirit medicine that Qin Tianyi had given him. Relying on spirit medicine to break through to the creation realm was probably something that only people with average or even terrible talent would do. That was because relying on spirit medicine to break through to the next realm was completely different from relying on one's own effort. There were many drawbacks to relying on spirit medicine to break through to the next realm, and it was extremely detrimental to one's future cultivation. Unless it was absolutely necessary, Swordsmen would not choose to use spirit medicine to break through to the next realm. Thinking about it, this swordsman, who was only at the first heavenly layer of creation, had known Qin Tianyi for a long time. Perhaps he was also a disciple of the Flying Heaven Pavilion, which was why Qin Tianyi treated him so warmly. In that instant, Chu Mu did not know that so many thoughts had flashed through the minds of the two people who were still sitting. However, Qin Tianyi's next sentence surprised them, and they once again sized up Chu Mu. "Junior brother Chu, you must have received an invitation from the Heavenly Sword Hall, right?" Chapter 999. In the face of Qin Tianyi's inquiry, Chu Mu nodded and did not deny it. The two people sitting there could not hide their astonishment. They felt that the truth seemed to be different from what they had imagined. Not just any sword of Gojoseon could receive an invitation from the Heavenly Sword Hall. Only the true genius swordsman could have such an honor. "Brother Qin, you haven't introduced this little brother's background yet," one of the two men said as he stood up. As his thoughts raced, one of the two men stood up and laughed. The other woman's beautiful eyes widened as she looked at Chu Mu and then at Qin Tianyi. "This is my junior brother Chu Mu," Qin Tianyi said with a smile. "Chu Mu, I seem to have heard this name before." The man and woman, who looked somewhat similar, began to ponder. Immediately their eyes lit up. They looked at Chu Mu as if they had discovered a rare treasure. Could it be him? As they spoke, they also looked at Qin Tianyi. Qin Tianyi nodded. "It really is him. After hearing about it that day, I wondered when I would be able to meet him. I didn't expect to see him under such circumstances. The first creation disciple. It's a supreme honor." Qin Tianyi also took the opportunity to introduce the names of the man and woman, who looked somewhat similar to Chu Mu. They were brother and sister, and they came from the Great Eastern Dragon territory. The man was the elder brother, and his name was Su Qin. The woman was the younger sister, and her name was Su Yu. Su Qin's cultivation was at the 9th heavenly layer of creation, which was comparable to Qin Tianyi's. Su Yu's cultivation was at the 8th heavenly layer of creation, and her strength was also extraordinary. When one's cultivation reached their level, they were no longer restricted to any large territory. They could move freely. Of course, the ancient world was very large, and there were countless dangerous places. There were also many places that even King Realm experts could not set foot in. Chu Mu also greeted them. The Su siblings also nodded in response. Although their cultivation was far superior to Chu Mu's, Chu Mu was the first creation disciple. His future achievements would definitely not be lower than theirs. He might even surpass them. The two of them were not short-sighted people. Naturally, they would look further. Moreover, Chu Mu was Qin Tianyi's junior brother. Judging from Qin Tianyi's attitude, he was very good to Chu Mu. "Junior brother Chu, you have just broken through to the creation realm. I don't think you have gone through the certification of the Sword of Gojoseon yet," Qin Tianyi said. Chu Mu nodded, and a flash of understanding flashed across his eyes. When a swordsman's cultivation broke through to the creation realm, a kind of profound power would transform into the power of rules, and he would be considered to have the strength of a king realm expert. Therefore, people would think of him as the Sword of Gojoseon. However, in reality, only by going through certification and obtaining a title could he be considered a true Sword of Gojoseon. To put it simply, the former meant that one's strength had reached a certain level and was considered to be the Sword of Gojoseon. It was a kind of widespread recognition, like the recognition of the people. The latter meant that one had obtained a title, which was the official recognition. This official was the Heavenly Sword Hall. "Let's go. It just so happens that I have nothing to do today," Qin Tianyi said as he strode out. He was actually going to lead the way for Chu Mu. This made the Su siblings feel a little incredulous. Qin Tianyi's attitude towards Chu Mu was very good, and they were already surprised. Now that he was going to lead the way for Chu Mu, they were both surprised and puzzled. Even if Chu Mu obtained the honor of being the first creation disciple, It seemed that Qin Tianyi did not need to do this. It could be said that he was completely lowering himself to befriend Chu Mu and treating him as a peer. In fact, Qin Tianyi's strength was extremely powerful, almost reaching the peak of the sword of Gojoseon. He was much stronger than Su Qin. Chu Mu followed Qin Tianyi out, and the Su siblings followed behind. The place where the sword of Gojoseon's certification was in a side hall of the Heavenly Sword Hall, called the Tidal Palace. As soon as they entered the Tidal Palace, they saw a black sword steel standing between the heavens and the earth. The roof of the Tidal Palace seemed to be infinite, making the black sword steel infinitely tall. On the black sword steel there were countless titles and names. At this moment, many swordsmen had gathered in front of the huge Tidal sword steel to undergo the certification. Junior Brother Chu, the certification for the sword of Gojoseon is different from that for the sword Venerable. It's very simple. You only need to master one sword technique again. Qin Tianyi said, I believe that with Junior Brother Chu's talent, you should have mastered one sword technique again by now. Whether it was Qin Tianyi or the Su siblings, they could roughly see that Chu Mu had broken through to the creation realm within a year. Under normal circumstances, within a year after breaking through to the creation realm, one could at most transform two types of power of ultimacy into the power of rules. If one wanted to familiarize himself with one of the powers of rules and reach the level of mastering a sword technique again, it would take far more than a year. When they heard Qin Tianyi's words, a trace of doubt flashed across the Su siblings' eyes. They did not believe him. I have mastered it. Chu Mu nodded and replied calmly. Then, he strode towards the Tidal sword steel. Qin Tianyi's lips curled into a smile, while the Su siblings were stunned. For the certification, one did not need to draw his sword. He only needed to press his palm on the Tidal sword steel. When one approached the black Tidal sword steel, one could feel the coldness of the vicissitudes of life. The aura of the Tidal sword steel was very powerful, but it would not hurt anyone. Chu Mu approached and stretched out his jade-like hand. His slender fingers touched the surface of the Tidal sword steel first. When the cold current invaded his body, his palm pressed on the surface. All of a sudden, it was as if the world changed and darkness invaded. In an instant, Chu Mu appeared in a dark place. He did not panic at all because he knew that it was his consciousness that had appeared. The darkness changed and light descended. Heaven and earth were separated. Then, a black Tidal sword steel appeared before Chu Mu. Use your sword technique to shatter the Tidal sword steel. An ethereal voice sounded in the void. Chu Mu immediately understood what to do. With a thought, a sword condensed in his hand and he slashed. In an instant, a green wind blade tore through the sky and slashed towards the black Tidal sword steel. The green wind blade reached its limit in the blink of an eye and slashed the black Tidal sword steel. With a soft cracking sound, a corner of the black Tidal sword steel was directly cut off by the green wind blade. In the next moment, the black Tidal sword steel disappeared and the ethereal and majestic voice sounded again. Leave your title and name. Zhen Tian, Sword of Gojoseon, Chu Mu. Without hesitation, Chu Mu reported his titles. A light flashed on the black Tidal sword steel in the outside world, and a title and a name appeared among the countless titles. The changes on the Tidal sword steel were immediately noticed by the crowd. The swordsmen with their sharp eyesight immediately found the titles and names that were still emitting light. Zhen Tian, Sword of Gojoseon, Chu Mu. Su Qin read out softly and a look of realization appeared in his eyes. In just a year, not only did he successfully transform a type of law, but he also mastered a new sword technique. Such talent is really, for a moment, he seemed to understand why Qin Tianyi would treat Chu Mu like that. At this moment, the titles Zhen Tian, Sword of Gojoseon and Chu Mu shone brightly, as if they were about to leave the Tidal sword steel. At the same time, another title and name on the Tidal sword steel also emitted a strong light and trembled, as if they were about to leave the title sword steel. The other title and name were Zhen Tian, Sword of Gojosian, and Jiyu. It's actually a clash of titles. It's really rare to see a clash of titles. Qin Tianyi, Su Qin, and Su Yu's faces flashed with a hint of shock. However, in the immemorial world, there were many humans. It wasn't strange for the same title to appear. After all, no matter how hard you racked your brains to obtain a title, there was a possibility that it was the same as someone else's. Zhen Tian, Sword of Gojosian, Jiyu. I know him. He's a 7 stars Sword of Gojosian. Oh, 7 stars Sword of Gojosian. Then this new Sword of Gojosian will be in trouble. In a situation where the titles clashed, they naturally had to resolve it and determine the winner. The winner would have that title, while the loser would have to change their title. Jiyu was a 7 stars Sword of Gojosian. His strength was many times stronger than the Ichino Sword of Gojosian. With a light finger, he could instantly kill any Ichino Sword of Gojosian. Fortunately, there were 2 ways to determine the winner. One was to suppress their cultivation to the same level in the Heavenly Sword Hall. Then, they would have a decisive battle to determine the winner. The other way was to meet in the outside world and directly fight to the death. If they died, their titles would naturally not clash. If they met in the outside world, given Chu Mu's strength, he would definitely not be a match for Jiyu. He would be killed immediately. When the 2 titles almost separated from the title sword steel and shook, Chu Mu had a strong feeling. It was as if there was a powerful opponent waiting for him. At the same time, in another territory far away from the West Tiger territory, a middle-aged swordsman in a purple robe trembled. His tightly closed eyes instantly opened, emitting an extremely sharp green light that penetrated into the void. It was as if he could see through thousands of miles, and was about to land on Chu Mu's body. This person was the 7 stars Sword of Gojosian, Jiyu. There's actually someone whose title clashes with mine. I didn't expect to encounter such an interesting thing. Jiyu muttered to himself. A faint smile appeared on his face. He seemed to find it very interesting. Since that's the case, I'll go to the Heavenly Sword Hall to take a look. If I see him in person. As soon as he finished speaking, Jiyu's figure flickered. Like a bolt of lightning, he streaked across the sky and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Chu Mu suddenly had a feeling that he would be facing a great battle soon. That battle would be related to the ownership of his title. However, the battle had yet to begin. There were other things that he had to do now. Congratulations, Junior, for obtaining your title. Qin Tianyi smiled at Chu Mu and said, however, I'm guessing that Jiyu will most likely rush over. When that time comes, there will be a lot of trouble. If it's trouble, we'll get rid of it, Chu Mu said. Good. That's the spirit you should have. Qin Tianyi smiled and said, Junior's main purpose for coming to the Heavenly Sword Hall should be the soldier's assessment. Let me take you there. When the others saw Qin Tianyi's attitude towards Chu Mu, they were all shocked. One had to know that Qin Tianyi was one of the 5 unique of the Western Tiger. He was the powerful 9 stars Sword of Gojosian. He was famous and many people recognized him. There were also many people who wanted to befriend him. However, how could the friendship of the 5 unique of the Western Tiger be so easy to befriend unless one was close to that level? Therefore, when they saw Qin Tianyi's attitude towards Chu Mu, they were all shocked. They all guessed Chu Mu's identity. Those who thought of it later trembled and revealed a shocked expression. Chapter 1000. With the help of Qin Tianyi, Chu Mu signed up for the Heavenly Sword Hall's Army of God assessment. The Heavenly Sword Hall's Army of God was divided into 3 levels. From low to high they were Sergeant, General, and Commander. The 3 levels of the Army of God also corresponded to the cultivation strength of the swordsman: Creation Realm, Nirvana Realm, and Eternal Realm. Chu Mu's cultivation was at the first sky of Creation Realm. He could only sign up for the Sergeant level assessment. Moreover, the assessment would not start immediately. Instead, it would have to wait for half a year. This was because the date of each assessment was fixed. There would be more than one person. A group of newly registered Sword of Gojosian would gather and start the assessment together. Qin Tianyi also gave Chu Mu some knowledge about the Army of God. After passing the Army of God assessment, one would receive the corresponding Army of God sword token. In addition to one's name and so on, there was also a column for military merit. Military merit was something like a currency that belonged to the Heavenly Sword Hall's Army of God. It was very useful and very important. In fact, most of the swordsmen who applied for the assessment of the Heavenly Sword Hall's Army of God were aiming for military merit. Whether it was sergeant, general, or commander, they were all divided into 4 sublevels: black iron, bronze, silver, and gold. Chu Mu had just applied for the sergeant assessment. If he passed the assessment in half a year, he would become a black iron sergeant. Only when he accumulated enough military merit could he apply for promotion to bronze sergeant, silver sergeant, and gold sergeant. The higher the level, the more authority he had. There was still half a year before the sergeant assessment. During this half a year, Qin Tianyi advised Chu Mu to stay in the Heavenly Sword Hall and cultivate slowly while waiting for the time to come. Otherwise, he would waste a lot of time going back and forth. Any Sword of Gojosian who had been certified with a title could stay in the Heavenly Sword Hall. However, they had to pay a price. The price was military merit. Chu Mu did not have any military merit. Qin Tianyi used his military merit to rent a cultivation room of the lowest level for Chu Mu. To Chu Mu, this was a great favor. To Qin Tianyi, the military merit consumed by a cultivation room of the lowest level was nothing. After that, Qin Tianyi said that he still had some things to deal with and left first. He hoped that Chu Mu would work hard to cultivate and one day they could fight side by side. Su Qin and Su Yu also left with Qin Tianyi. Staying in the cultivation room, Chu Mu concentrated on cultivation. The cultivation rooms of the Heavenly Sword Hall were divided into 3 levels: human, earth, and sky. They corresponded to the sergeant, warrior, and commander levels of the Army of God. Each level was further divided into low-grade, mid-grade, high-grade, and top-grade. Chu Mu was in the low-grade cultivation room. Firstly, the low-grade human-grade cultivation room required the least amount of military merit. Secondly, it was because Chu Mu had not passed the assessment. Even if he passed the assessment and became a black iron rank sergeant, he could only cultivate in the low-grade human-grade cultivation room. The yuan qi of heaven and earth in the low-grade human-grade cultivation room was twice as rich as the outside world. Cultivating in such a place would naturally be faster than cultivating in the outside world. After all, a swordsman could not use yuan crystals to cultivate all the time. That would require a large amount of yuan crystals. Except for those disciples who were heavily nurtured by large factions, the vast majority of swordsmen could not afford it. Chu Mu was different. In his interspatial ring, there were hundreds of millions of high-grade yuan crystals and more than 6 million top-grade yuan crystals. In addition, there were also 5 kilograms of yuan liquid. With Chu Mu's current cultivation, the effect of using top-grade yuan crystals to cultivate was not as good as using high-grade yuan crystals. However, the effect of yuan liquid was the best. It was not like elixirs, which were somewhat poisonous. Staying in the cultivation room, Chu Mu began to consume yuan liquid and cultivate, causing his sword origin to grow little by little. After refining 1 kilogram of yuan liquid, the Sky Desolation's sword origin had clearly strengthened a lot. He began to cultivate the metal sword skill chop iron and the wind sword skill break wind. Then he began to cultivate the thunder sword skill, familiarizing himself with the rules of thunder, studying the more tyrannical vibration power, and so on. The assessment time was half a year later. During this period of time, Chu Mu had to improve his strength as much as possible. He had to become even more powerful to ensure that he could pass the assessment. As time passed, A figure of light came from outside and entered the West Tiger territory, rapidly heading towards the Heavenly Sword Hall. In the cultivation room, other than a futon, there was also a black stone statue. The stone statue was incomparably hard. It was used by swordsmen to test their power when they were cultivating their sword skills. It had the ability to automatically recover. Standing before the black stone statue, Chu Mu's eyes shone brightly. His right hand gripped the Wild Thunder sacred sword tightly, ready to strike. His strength was gathering. What he was gathering was not sword origin, nor was it the power of his consciousness. It was pure physical strength. He began to cultivate the fourth level of the Sky Desolation sword body. His body was strengthening little by little. Also, because of the tempering of the vigorous vitality of the wood form origin, the effect of the fourth level of the Sky Desolation sword body was more obvious than before. His current body was much stronger than when he was in the divine condensation realm. It could withstand a higher frequency of vibration power. The strength in his body was constantly mobilized and gathered bit by bit. Suddenly, his right arm began to vibrate slightly. The frequency of vibration became faster and faster. Wave after wave of vibration power was transmitted to the Wild Thunder sacred sword in his hand. The buzzing sound was so dense that it made one's scalp go numb. Looking at it with the naked eye, the Wild Thunder sacred sword was no different from before. Only by touching it with the power of consciousness could one feel that the Wild Thunder sacred sword was vibrating at a terrifying frequency. The void at the edge of the sacred sword's blade showed signs of being torn apart because of the high frequency of vibration power. The frequency of vibration is not enough at this moment. The frequency of vibration had exceeded the previous limit of the mountain quake force and was going to a higher level. However, Chu Mu felt that it was not enough. It was far from enough because the degree of increase was too low. The imagined power of the earthquake force was at least 10 times that of the mountain quake force. Otherwise, how could it possibly crack the earth? If its power was 10 times that of the mountain quake force, then even if the frequency of vibration did not reach 10 times, it would at least be several times higher. If the frequency of vibration of the mountain quake force was 10,000 times per breath, then the frequency of vibration of the earthquake force was at least 30,000 times per breath. With every increase in the frequency of vibration, the power of the vibration power would obviously increase. Chu Mu was constantly controlling and increasing the frequency of vibration. Gradually, he felt the muscles in his arm become sore and numb. There was a slight pain in his palm, as if it was about to be torn apart. When using the mountain quake force, his hand holding the sword would naturally bear the corresponding rebound force. If it was not strong enough, it would be damaged by the high-frequency vibration power. Have I reached the limit? Chu Mu could not help but think to himself. However, he was extremely unwilling because he felt that the frequency of vibration was not enough. It was really not enough. However, the soreness in his right arm became more and more obvious. The numbness in his palm became more and more intense. Even his right arm and shoulder were beginning to be affected and gradually transmitted to the rest of his body. In an instant, the sound of a sword light was heard, melodious in the cultivation room. A bright sword light tore through the sky like a thunderbolt from the ninth heaven. It suddenly flashed and slashed at the black stone statue in front of him. Amidst a frightening buzzing sound, the berserk thunder sacred sword disappeared. It turned into a bolt of lightning that vibrated at a high speed. It fiercely struck the black stone statue. With a cracking sound, a corner of the incomparably tough stone statue was immediately chopped off. This kind of black stone statue was made of special materials and was extremely hard. It could only be destroyed by a first-grade earth-rank sword skill. Now that Chu Mu had chopped off a corner of the statue with pure vibration power, the power of this sword move had already surpassed sword arts and was close to a first-grade earth-rank sword skill. If I can truly master the earthquake force, The power of this sword move will be comparable to that of cutting iron, Chu Mu said to himself. After a short rest, the origin energy of the wood form was filled with vitality. With every powerful beat of his heart, it was poured into every part of his body. His sore and numb right arm and right palm quickly recovered under the nourishment of the exuberant vitality. After recovering, the strength of his right arm seemed to have increased. He began to cultivate again, using the power of his divine sense to control his own strength and gather it from all parts of his body. On his right arm, there was another high-frequency vibration. The tyrannical vibration power surged towards his palm wave after wave and was transmitted to the violent thunder sacred sword, causing the violent thunder sacred sword to vibrate at high speed again. The thunderbolt power contained in the violent thunder sacred sword became extremely violent under the high-frequency vibration power. Its power was even more tyrannical and terrifying. With the previous experience, this time, Chu Mu was even more proficient with the vibration power. The frequency of the vibration had already exceeded the limit of the mountain quake force and reached the peak that it had reached previously. Chu Mu's arm also felt sore and numb, and his palm also felt a tearing pain. However, the vigorous vitality of the wood phase origin energy, the incomparably fast healing speed, and the slight increase in strength after the healing allowed Chu Mu to see a way to quickly cultivate the vibration power. The most direct and most violent way to cultivate was to ignore the damage to his right arm and body and do his best to bear the vibration power of a higher frequency and constantly adapt. Even if he was injured, he could use the vigorous vitality of the wood phase origin energy to quickly recover. He would strive to master the vibration power of a higher frequency as soon as possible and cultivate the earthquake force. Chu Mu was sure that if he cultivated the earthquake force, his attack power would be further enhanced and become even more tyrannical. He cultivated tirelessly, not wasting a single moment. He grasped every step and every change under the careful control of Chu Mu's divine sense. Every time, the vibration frequency of the vibration power would reach the limit that his right arm could bear, causing his right arm to be injured, but the injury was not serious. Then, he would slash out with his sword. The terrifying vibration sword would cut off the corners of the black stone statue again and again, and the corners would become bigger and bigger. After that, he consciously drove the vigorous vitality of the wood phase origin energy into his arm to heal it. Every time, the healing speed was extremely fast. In just a dozen breaths, he was completely healed. After the healing, the strength of his right arm increased slightly. Then, he continued to cultivate the vibration power. The frequency of the vibration would exceed the limit of the previous time. Chapter 1001. Chop! A thunderous roar reverberated through the training room. The berserk thunder sacred sword disappeared and was replaced by a blazing white bolt of lightning. It descended from the heavens with unparalleled speed and power. It could destroy everything as it descended and viciously slashed at the black stone statue. With a cracking sound, the frenzy sacred sword pierced halfway into the black stone statue's neck. Break! With a loud roar, his aura skyrocketed. The vibrating power that was about to return to silence erupted once again. The frenzy sacred sword vibrated at a high frequency once again. Under the terrifying power, it slashed into the black stone statue's neck and sent it flying. With a bang, Chu Mu's right arm exploded with bloody holes. Flesh and blood flew everywhere. Even the bones inside were damaged and almost broken. The intense pain made Chu Mu's face pale. Cold sweat seeped from his forehead and dripped down. The corners of his eyes couldn't help but twitch. However, he didn't make a sound. Exuberant life force surged out from the wood phase origin, pouring into the heavily injured right arm. Over a dozen bloody holes were blasted open in Chu Mu's body, revealing the white bones of his broken right arm. It was rapidly recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. The broken bones were quickly corrected by a powerful vitality. They were reconnected and restored. After the restoration, the color of the bones was even rounder. Obviously, they were harder and more resilient. His bones were recovering under the vitality of the wood aspect. The bloody holes in his arm were also recovering rapidly under the vitality of the wood aspect. Not long after, his wounded right arm was restored to its original state. His skin looked even more translucent. Chu Mu slightly tightened his grip on the frenzy sacred sword. He felt an incomparably strong power surging in his right arm. It was as if it could destroy mountains. His right arm was strengthened even more. Once again, he gathered all the power in his body and vibrated at a higher frequency. It was transmitted to the frenzy sacred sword and slashed out. The black stone statue, which had already recovered, had its neck cut off once again. Chu Mu only felt a slight hindrance from the thunderous strike. It was not as obvious as before, but at the same time, Chu Mu's arm was injured once again. Fortunately, Chu Mu had refined the wood avatar's origin. Otherwise, he wouldn't have dared to cultivate like this. Chu Mu had suffered heavy injuries twice in a row. Even though he had the vigorous vitality of the wood avatar to recover, his mental strength had been greatly depleted. He could no longer force himself to continue cultivating. Instead, he sat on the praying mat to recover. After recovering, Chu Mu calculated the time and realized that half a year was almost up. He thought to himself, cultivation knows no time. He got up, opened the door, and walked out of the cultivation room. Qin Tianyi had only rented this cultivation room for half a year, and today was the last day. He walked out of the cultivation room. The cultivation rooms he was in were arranged in a row in a corner of the Heavenly Sword Hall. It was also considered a side hall and was called the cultivation hall. After leaving the cultivation hall, he headed to the main hall. After entering the main hall, people pointed at Chu Mu and whispered among themselves. Immediately after, a person stood up from his chair. He was dressed in a purple robe and his figure was like a mountain. He arrived in front of Chu Mu in an instant. "It's Jiyu." "I know. Jiyu's goal is Chu Mu. Jiyu's title is Zhentian, Sword of Gojoseon. Chu Mu's title is also Zhentian, causing a conflict between their titles. There will definitely be a battle between them to determine who is better and who will be the Zhentian title in the end. Now there will be a good show to watch." The Sword of Gojoseon and the surroundings were all waiting to watch a good show. To them, who were not sitting here to discuss the Tao or fight to the death with the foreign races, this kind of thing was a spark in their lives. It would make them watch a good show and have more things to talk about. Chu Mu, the purple-robed person, appeared in front of Chu Mu and said, "Jiyu." A thought flashed through his mind, and he unconsciously thought of this name. He also said it casually. "It was a feeling. I've been waiting for you for more than 2 months, Jiyu said calmly. "Sorry to keep you waiting." When the two titles on the titled sword steel clashed, Chu Mu knew that he and Jiyu, Sword of Gojoseon, who also had the title of Zhentian, would definitely compete to determine who was better and who would be the one to obtain the title based on their strength. Chu Mu also had a feeling that it would not be long. Therefore, he was not surprised that Jiyu appeared in front of him now. "I've been using the title of Zhentian for more than 200 years. Jiyu stared at Chu Mu with bright eyes and said word by word, "Why don't you change your title and we can settle this peacefully? This title has a special meaning to me as well." Chu Mu was not moved. This kind of thing, he did not have to give it to you just because you had been using it for a long time. Such a reason was too weak. The reason why Chu Mu chose Zhentian as his title was completely because of a trace of concern and a trace of stubbornness in his heart. He had never forgotten his birth, his origin, and his soul. He came from a planet called Earth. There, he was apprenticed to the Zhentian school and became a disciple of the Zhentian school. Even though his soul had transmigrated to this world, everything about the Zhentian school had always influenced him. It was also one of the reasons why he was able to surpass many swordsmen. Therefore, the two words gentillon carried a trace of concern for him. He could not cut it off, and there was no need to cut it off. No matter what reason Ji had, it was impossible for Chu Mu to give up this title. Even though he was defeated by Ji this time, Chu Mu would still work hard to cultivate and strengthen himself. One day, he would fight against Ji again and take this title. No one understood his stubbornness about these two words. It seems that it is impossible to resolve this peacefully. Ji's expression did not change. He said slowly, "There will be a battle between us. With the strength of the Ichino sword of Gojoseon, you are no match for me. However, I will give you a relatively fair chance. In the Heavenly Sword Hall, I will suppress my cultivation to the same level as yours and fight with you for the title." Okay. Chu Mu nodded without hesitation. There was not a trace of fear in his heart. "I do admire you. However, I will not go easy on you." Ji smiled. "Today, I am going to participate in the soldier assessment. Why don't we put the battle after the assessment?" Chu Mu said after thinking for a while. If he fought now, it would undoubtedly affect his assessment. If he did not pass the assessment this time, he would have to wait for some time for the next assessment. Soldier assessment. Ji was stunned when he heard this. He was a little surprised and looked at Chu Mu a few more times. "Judging from the waves of your aura, you seem to have just broken through to the Blessed Realm. You want to participate in the soldier assessment with your current strength? Isn't this a little too hasty?" Ji's words were not without reason. Under normal circumstances, when the sword of Gojoseon participated in the soldier assessment, most of them would wait until they were stronger. Usually, they would wait until their cultivation had reached the second level of Blessed Realm and they were more familiar with the rules. Then, they would have a greater chance of success. This was because the soldier assessment was not a game. It was dangerous. If one was not strong enough, they might die in the assessment. Even if they did not die, they would not be able to pass the assessment. It was not that there were no swordsmen who could pass the soldier assessment with the strength of the Ichino sword of Gojoseon, but the ratio was very small. Every swordsman who could pass the soldier assessment with the strength of the Ichino sword of Gojoseon was a peerless genius. As long as they did not die, their future achievements would not be low. All right, since that is the case, why don't we make an agreement? Ji clapped his hands and made a decision. Let's use the soldier assessment as an example. If you do not pass the assessment, there will be two outcomes. The first is that you die in the assessment, and the title of gentillon will naturally be mine. The second is that you come back alive, and if you fail the assessment, you will automatically give up the title of gentillon. If you successfully pass the soldier assessment, then we will fight to determine who the title of gentillon belongs to. Ji said. Although his tone was not overbearing, the sharpness in his words was not to be underestimated. In fact, with his status as the 7 stars sword of Gojoseon, speaking to Chu Mu in such a gentle manner was already showing great respect for Chu Mu. The difference between each star of the sword of Gojoseon was huge, not to mention the difference between the 7 stars and the 7 stars. When the bystanders saw Ji speaking to Chu Mu with such an attitude and even making an agreement, they were all shocked. Ji treated Chu Mu with such an attitude because he was not an overbearing person. Moreover, he had also learned about Chu Mu's background during this period of time. He was a disciple of the Flying Heaven Pavilion, the #1 disciple of the Fortune Gate, and was valued by Qin Tianyi. After all, the fight for the title was not a blood feud. There was no need to be so hostile. All right, Chu Mu replied without the slightest hesitation. If he couldn't even pass the soldier assessment, how could he compete for the title? This was also a kind of motivation for himself. I wish you success in the assessment. Ji smiled and turned to leave. Chu Mu nodded and strode to the location of the soldier assessment to gather with the others. About 2 hours later, all the sword of Gojoseon who had signed up for the assessment had arrived. Under the lead of the elders of the Heavenly Sword Hall, they walked onto a 1,000-meter-long battleship. There were more than 1,000 sword of Gojoseon who had signed up for the soldier assessment this time. Some of them were sword of Gojoseon from the West Tiger Territory, and some were sword of Gojoseon from other territories who had come to the West Tiger Territory to train. Chumu discovered that most of the sword of Gojoseon's cultivation was higher than his. They were at least at the second heavenly layer of the creation realm, and there were many at the third heavenly layer of the creation realm. Chumu even discovered that some of the sword of Gojoseon's cultivation had reached the fourth heavenly layer of the creation realm. The Heavenly Sword Hall's Army of God assessment did not have an age limit. The requirement was that one had to reach the level of the sword of Gojoseon. As for the upper limit, there was no limit. For example, Chumu, whose cultivation had only reached the first heavenly layer of the creation realm, the number of sword of Gojoseon was the smallest among the thousands of people. There were only a few dozen of them. Therefore, these people were also sized up by the crowd, which seemed to be surprising. After everyone gathered, the battleship of the Heavenly Sword Hall began to take off and soared into the sky. Its speed became faster and faster as it headed outside the West Tiger Territory. Chapter 1002. The battleship of the Heavenly Sword Hall was 1,000 meters long and completely black. Like a huge flying sword, it instantly surpassed the speed of sound and created layers of ripples in the sky. The terrifying ripples spread out and shattered the white clouds in the sky. It swept away everything as if it was a vacuum. Amidst the sharp roar, the huge sword-shaped black battleship broke through the sky and traveled 10,000 meters in an instant. It left the Heavenly Sword Hall and flew out of the West Tiger Territory at an extremely fast speed. The location of the soldier assessment was not in the West Tiger Territory but in a specific place. The people participating in the assessment were not only the sword of Gojoseon of the West Tiger Sword Shrine, the sword of Gojoseon of the East Dragon Sword Shrine, the South Sparrow Sword Shrine, and the North Martial Sword Shrine would also arrive at the same time to take the assessment together. The battleship of the Heavenly Sword Hall was very high-end. Its speed was extremely fast, more than 100 times the speed of sound. It was like a black immemorial ghost shuttling through the sky of the immemorial world. No clouds could stop it. They would be pierced through by the impact of this battleship and then shattered. Thousands of sword of Gojoseon who were preparing to take the assessment lived on the battleship. Everyone was assigned a room to live peacefully and cultivate quietly. There was also a battle arena and so on for the sword of Gojoseon to spar with their swordsmanship. There was also a public training room for the sword of Gojoseon to display their sword skills and cultivate. In the training room, Chumu faced a black stone statue. It was the same as the black stone statue in the training room of the Heavenly Sword Hall. With a wave of his hand, the violent thunder sacred sword was unsheathed. A blazing white light shone dazzlingly. It was as fast as lightning. The sword stabbed out. With a cracking sound, it turned into a thunderbolt. It zigzagged through the air and tore through the sky. In the blink of an eye, it bombarded the black stone statue that was dozens of meters away. The black stone statue's head instantly exploded into pieces. The power of this sword immediately attracted the attention of many sword of Gojoseon in the surroundings. A first-grade Earth-rank thunder sword skill. But how can it be so powerful? Many sword of Gojoseon frowned in surprise. Immediately, their gazes fell on the violent thunder sacred sword in Chumu's hand. With a hint of thought, their eyes burst out with a strong light. They reacted and realized that the sacred sword in Chumu's hand was extraordinary. It was definitely a treasure among sacred swords. There were even some people who were eyeing the violent thunder sacred sword. But the sword of Gojoseon, the sword of Gojoseon, the sword sacred sword divine sword sacred sword of Gojoseon Gojosephon. Thunder sword of thunder sword Thunder of thunder, 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 sword, 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 sword of Gojosian, sacred sword of thunder, of light, of violent, of Gojosian, sword, sword, thunder. In front of others, unless it was a battle of life and death, Chu Mu would never use the power of a top-grade god-rank divine sword. He would only limit his power to a top-grade heaven-rank divine sword, sacred sword. The violent thunder break displayed by Chu Mu was even more powerful, shattering the black stone statue's head. In terms of power, the current violent thunder break was the strongest sword skill Huang Xiaolong had mastered so far. The sword was like a stream of light, mixed with the power of thunder, slashing out again. Another dazzling white lightning bolt tore through the sky, bombarding the black stone statue's body with unparalleled violence and destruction. Amidst the ear-piercing cracking sounds, a fist-sized hole appeared on the black stone statue's chest, penetrating its back. Chu Mu did not display any other sword skills. He just stood there, displaying the violent thunder break again and again, continuously familiarizing himself with it and deepening his mastery of the violent thunder break. At the same time, the power of the violent thunder break increased little by little. The berserk thunder break was used over and over again. The surrounding sword kings also lost interest in watching and turned to cultivate on their own. However, in their hearts they still had various ideas. A mere first heavenly layer fortune realm cultivation was nothing in their eyes. Even though the battleship's speed was 100 times faster than the speed of sound, it still couldn't reach the assessment location so quickly. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, a month had passed. "Brother Chu, take another sword of mine." A figure floated in front of him, and a sword light exploded like fire, turning into raging flames that covered the sky, burning fiercely as if it could burn everything. The fire covered the sky, attacking Chu Mu. His eyes reflected the raging flames, as if he wanted to live eternally in the raging flames. He stood there motionlessly, as if he wanted to be covered by the raging flames. In an instant Chu Mu moved. The violent thunder sacred sword turned into a blazing white thunderbolt, circling around his body in the blink of an eye. The tyrannical thunderbolt sword momentum was unparalleled, sweeping away the raging flames that surrounded him. Then, he thrust his sword forward. The dazzling blazing white thunderbolt tore through the air, instantly piercing through the raging flames in the sky. It pierced through the void, and in the blink of an eye, shot towards the fiery red figure. With a poochie sound, the figure couldn't dodge in time. He hurriedly raised his sword to block, but was directly struck by the violent thunder break. He flew backward, his blood and chi churning, his face flushed red, and his entire body was powerless. Chu Mu did not follow up with another attack. He withdrew his sword, because this was not a battle of life and death, and the outcome had already been decided. "Brother Chu, the power of your violent thunder break is really strong." The fiery red figure caught his breath, and in a flash, he appeared in front of Chu Mu. He had a bitter smile on his face, looking very helpless and somewhat unwilling. His name was Yang Lai, and like Chu Mu, he was an Ichino sword of Gojosian. However, he was a few years older than Chu Mu. He had broken through to the first heavenly layer of creation, which was about a year earlier than Chu Mu. He was the young master of a small force, the Burning Mountain clan. The 5 major forces produced many geniuses, and in some small forces, there were also some geniuses who were focused on nurturing. Even if they were placed in the 5 major forces, they could still be ranked. Yang Lai was such a genius, but there were relatively few geniuses like him in small forces. Perhaps it was because they were both a Chino sword of Gojosian, or perhaps it was because he had a more straightforward personality, or perhaps it was because he was more battle-hungry. He got to know Chu Mu and gradually became friends. Yang Lai had profound attainments in the law of fire, and it seemed that the Burning Mountain clan specialized in the law of fire. Chu Mu only displayed the law of thunder, and did not display any other law powers. Even so, Chu Mu's violent thunderbreak was often able to gain the upper hand. Of course, Yang Lai's strength should be hidden. After all, it was not a battle of life and death, and it was just a spar. Chu Mu's strength was also hidden. Your raging fire-burning mountain's might is also extraordinary. Chu Mu faintly smiled and said, "Haha, let's go. I'll treat you to a drink." Yang Lai laughed. After a month, the thousands of Sword of Gojoseon got to know each other. They knew each other's names, and some even became partners. The dozens of Ichino Sword of Gojoseon could be considered the lowest level among the thousands of Sword of Gojoseon. Of course, it was undeniable that some of them hid their strength, and they might have the ability to fight above their level. Among them, the more famous ones were the 4-star Sword of Gojoseon, whose cultivation had reached the 4th heavenly layer of Fortune Realm. Although their talent was average, their cultivation was profound. It should be known that just based on the difference in cultivation, a 4-star Sword of Gojoseon was 1,000 times stronger than an Ichino Sword of Gojoseon. This gap was not easy to fill. Apart from the few 4-star Sword of Gojoseon, there was also a group of Samsung Sword of Gojoseon who were more famous because of their strength. There was even a Samsung Sword of Gojoseon called Yu Byakuya from Heartbreak Pavilion. He was very powerful and domineering, and he defeated thousands of Sword of Gojoseon. Even the 4-star Sword of Gojoseon were defeated. Since there were disciples from Heartbreak Pavilion, there were naturally disciples from other major forces. There were also disciples from the Flying Heaven Pavilion. The days passed by as they cultivated, exchanged pointers, and drank wine. The testing ground was a stretch of ruins, a seemingly boundless stretch of ruins without boundaries. 4 black battleships that were 1,000 meters long flew over rapidly from 4 directions. They passed through the seal of the examination ground, creating layers of ripples in the void. The ripples spread out, making the seal of the examination ground look like a calm lake with a stone thrown into it. In 4 different directions there were 4 black battleships that looked like giant swords. Each battleship had its own symbol. One had the symbol of a white tiger, one had the symbol of an azure dragon, one had the symbol of a tortoise snake, and one had the symbol of a vermilion bird. West Tiger, East Dragon, North Marshal, and South Sparrow. The 4 branches of the Heavenly Sword Hall had gathered. The 4 battleships did not approach each other, but they could see each other. They stopped in a corner above the examination ground. Immediately, the Sword of Gojoseon who were going to participate in the examination appeared on the deck of the battleship. The examination will last for 3 months. If you survive and obtain 10 tokens and return to the battleship, you will pass the examination. Now you should go down. An old and majestic voice rang out from the battleship. At the same time, it entered everyone's ears, telling them what to do to pass the examination. As for the examination ground, no one was very clear. They would only know if they entered it personally. However, as the battleship flew over, everyone had their own discussions. They more or less had some understanding of the examination of the Heavenly Sword Hall. They knew that the examination was not easy and was not safe. Instead, it was life-threatening. If they were not careful, they would lose their lives. It could be said that the examination of the Heavenly Sword Hall was not only not easy, but also somewhat cruel. Although 3 months wasn't a long time, it was possible that they would face countless dangers. Once they became a soldier of the Heavenly Sword Hall, they would become the backbone of the human clan. Fighting with the foreign races to the death had extremely high requirements for their survival ability. It was very important to know how to survive in the adversity of life and death. Therefore, the 3-month test was only a test. If one couldn't even pass the 3-month test, in the future, when they fought against the non-humankind, they would only be contributing to the non-humankind. At this moment, the examination was about to begin. The eyes of the thousands of Sword of Gojoseon shone brightly. They were full of fighting spirit. Immediately after, Yu Byakuya was the first to move. He turned into a stream of light and shot through the air. He passed through the seal of the battleship and landed on the examination ground. Figures left the battleship one after another like flying locusts. They were projected onto the ground of the examination ground. It was as if there was a meteor shower in the sky. Each figure was like a meteor that fell straight to the ground. Chapter 1003. 4 huge black warships and more than 4,000 light shadows fell like a grand fireworks display. When they landed, everyone was shocked by what they saw. Dilapidated fences and dilapidated walls, charred smoke, just like a ruin. There were all kinds of auras remaining, and it was very complicated. Turned out that the assessment site was actually a ruin. Through the surrounding dilapidated walls and collapsed stone pillars, one could vaguely see that there was once a palace here. More than 4,000 Sword of Gojosian who participated in the assessment landed at the 4 corners of the assessment site. What was interesting was that in each of the 4 corners, there were dilapidated palaces. After seeing the surroundings clearly, the power of divine sense swept across. Immediately, many Sword of Gojosian immediately moved and left quickly. The assessment of a sergeant was not only to survive for 3 months in the assessment site, but also to obtain at least 10 tokens and return to the warship alive. Only then would they be considered to have passed the assessment. No one knew where the token was located. They didn't even know what the token looked like. The only thing they could be sure of was that the token existed in every corner of the test ground. 3 months was actually very short. If one did not do his best, he might not be able to obtain 10 tokens. Therefore, it was a race against time. As for what kind of dangers existed in the assessment site, one would only know when one faced them personally. Counter soldiers with arms, water with an earth weir. That was all. However, an accident that no one expected happened. When the first Sword of Gojosian rushed out of the ruins of the palace, suddenly, a sharp and dazzling cold light flashed through the void, leaving a faint black mark as if it had cut open the space. It was unusually fierce and made people's hearts palpitate. Before the Sword of Gojosian could react, it was cut in half at the waist, and blood and internal organs sprayed out. This scene immediately stunned the Sword of Gojosian. They were extremely shocked. After the sharp and dazzling blade light slashed through, it disappeared as if it had never appeared. If it were not for the trace of blood in the air, the dazzling scarlet blood on the ground, and the corpse that was cut in half at the waist, everyone would have thought that the extremely fierce blade light was an illusion. The Sword of Gojosian that was killed was an Ichino Sword of Gojosian. Moreover, it was an ordinary Ichino Sword of Gojosian. Its strength was truly at the bottom of the list. Even so, it was killed in an instant without even being able to react. This made everyone's hearts tremble slightly, and they became highly vigilant. They had an intuitive understanding of the dangers of the assessment site. Byakuya snorted coldly and strode out of the palace ruins. As soon as he moved, several Sword of Gojosian followed him. They were all led by Byakuya. Byakuya, whose cultivation had reached the 3rd heavenly layer of creation, had tyrannical strength that surpassed that of an ordinary 4-star Sword of Gojosian. It could be said that in everyone's hearts, he was the strongest among all the Sword of Gojosian present. If even he could not walk out of the palace ruins, then the others could not even dream of passing the assessment. Byakuya's expression was cold and his eyes were cold. He strode forward, faster and faster. Soon after, he took a step forward and was about to pass by the Sword of Gojosian's corpse on the ground. At the same time, he reached out to grab the space ring of the Sword of Gojosian. At this moment, a dazzling and sharp saber light flashed again. It cut across the void like an aurora. Byakuya was already prepared. The moment the dazzling and sharp saber light appeared, he retreated slightly and narrowly avoided the cold saber light. He unsheathed the instant sword. The sword was like an aurora in the daytime. It tore through the darkness, pierced through the void and shattered the vacuum. This sword had a vast and irresistible power. Byakuya's sword seemed to have stabbed into thin air. Then, a splashing sound was heard, followed by a sharp and mournful cry. Immediately after, a figure appeared under Byakuya's sword. The grayish-brown figure stunned everyone. It was a strange beast in the shape of a praying mantis. It was as tall as a man and had 2 sabers. The sabers emitted a hazy, dark blue luster and were astonishingly sharp. Byakuya's sword was pierced into the triangular head of this strange praying mantis. With a twist of his wrist, the sword rotated above the praying mantis' head. Dark green blood spurted out. In an instant, he pulled out the sword. Large amounts of dark green blood spurted out like spring water. The praying mantis' body fell back on the ground, twitching until it died. With a flick of the tip of Byakuya's sword, the sword of Gojoseon's spatial ring flew into his hand. Then, he kicked away the praying mantis corpse. With another flick of his sword, a sword-shaped token flew into Byakuya's hand. Everyone saw the shape of the token clearly and knew what it was. That praying mantis isn't truly invisible. Instead, it's able to use its surroundings like a chameleon, merging with the environment and catching people off guard. Chumu came to a realization. "Brother Chu, shall we move together?" Yang Lai invited. However, Chumu shook his head slightly. "I like to move alone." Yang Lai was magnanimous. He wasn't angered by Chumu's rejection. Instead, he smiled and said, "All right. Then I wish Brother Chu success and success in passing the test." Likewise. Chumu faintly smiled and said, "With Byakuya taking the lead and killing the praying mantis, the rest of the sword of Gojoseon were on high alert. They left the palace ruins either alone or in group. Byakuya had taken the lead and obtained a token. They had to work hard too. The terrain of the test ground was very chaotic. This place was full of rocks, and the next step could be a flowing river or a mountain forest. There was no pattern at all, making people feel confused. Moreover, the air flow in the test ground was also very chaotic. Cyclones of various sizes would sweep in from time to time. The small ones would disappear after a short while the large ones could even threaten the life of the sword of Gojoseon. In short, the environment of the test ground was very bad. His sword was like thunder from the 9 heavens, tearing through the void and shattering everything. A lizard beast's head was smashed by Chumu, and it fell to the ground dead. Chumu didn't have time to rest because dozens of attacks were coming at him from all directions at the same time. These lizard beasts stood like humans. Their scarlet tongues flickered like venomous snakes, and their diamond-shaped yellow pupils were cold and emotionless, filled with killing intent. Their claws were extremely sharp and could easily cut through royal-grade swords. It was very terrifying. These lizard beasts' individual strength was at the level of an ordinary Ichino sword of Gojoseon. However, they lived in groups, and there were usually hundreds of them in a group. Moreover, each lizard beast had mastered a type of law power, and their attacks were very powerful. They were comparable to an Earth Rank 1 advanced sword skill. It was very terrifying. Dozens of Earth Rank 1 advanced sword skill lights bombarded Chumu as if they were going to kill him. In the face of such a dense and powerful attack, Chumu's expression was stern. He didn't dare to relax in the slightest. His figure moved around and the space law merged into his body. He moved erratically and quickly dodged dozens of attacks. After dodging dozens of attacks, he attacked again. Swoosh! Swoosh! Sword light flashed. After 2 moves in a row, green wind spiraled and shot out from the violent thunder sacred sword. The 1-meter-long green wind blade was densely covered with blazing white electric arcs, increasing the power of the violent thunder sacred sword. For the second move, a blazing white thunderbolt pierced through the void and blasted out. The violent thunder sacred sword skill was even more powerful. Under the 2 moves, many lizard beasts' bodies were cut in half. Their bodies were blasted into pieces and they pierced through. The lizard beasts didn't seem to know what fear was. They kept dying under Chu-Mu's sword. The blood and corpses of their companions stimulated their ferocious nature, and they became even more brutal. They were not afraid of death, and they attacked crazily as if they wanted to perish together with Chu-Mu. His expression didn't change at all. His expression was cold and sinister. He didn't care about the outside world at all. His hand gripped the violent thunder's sacred sword tightly, and he killed the lizard beasts again and again without any mercy. At this time, if there was a trace of wavering, a trace of weakness, or a trace of fear, the battle situation would be reversed, and it would be very disadvantageous for him. Chu-Mu's mind was incomparably firm. It was just killing a group of ferocious beasts. Even if it was a human, he wouldn't waver in the slightest. Kill, kill, kill. Over 100 lizard-mutated beasts died under Chu-Mu's sword one after another. The ground was splattered with dark green blood, and the stench was incomparably foul. There were also lizard beasts' corpses scattered everywhere, and their broken limbs were a ghastly sight. The last sword arrived in the air, and its trajectory was ethereal. It silently pierced through the head of the last lizard beast, killing it. After a series of killings, there wasn't a trace of blood on the violent thunder's sacred sword. There wasn't even a trace of smell, because any trace of blood or smell would be annihilated under the tyrannical power of the violent thunder's sacred sword. The divine slaughter weapon was activated. Immediately, wisps of gray aura rose from the lizard beasts' corpses on the ground and surged towards Chu-Mu like rivers flowing into the sea. They were absorbed by Chu-Mu's body into his middle dantian, and were absorbed by the sword embryo. The sword embryo was very active. The negative aura of these lizard beasts is actually so pure and rich. Chu-Mu was secretly surprised. The strength of these lizard beasts was only comparable to an ordinary Ichino sword of Gojoseon. However, the negative aura produced after they were killed was comparable to the negative aura of the mid-tier sword of Gojoseon that Chu-Mu had absorbed before. This is a good place. In 3 months, the Kamihira sword embryo will definitely grow a lot. Chu-Mu smiled, and his eyes became fanatical. The Kamihira sword embryo in his middle dantian seemed to have sensed Chu-Mu's thoughts. It vibrated gently, and a series of sword hums sounded. It was very happy. Chu-Mu also sensed the joy of the Kamihira sword embryo, and a smile appeared on his face. Immediately, his divine consciousness swept across the surroundings, carefully searching every inch of the ground. He found something. With a thought, the power of his divine consciousness turned into an invisible hand and lifted up a huge rock. Under the rock, a sword-shaped token lay quietly. The third one, Chu-Mu's hand of divine consciousness grabbed the token and stored it in his interspatial ring. This was the third token he had found after entering the examination ground. These tokens were in different locations. Some were under the huge rock, some were in the forest, some were in the water, and some were exposed on the ground. They were very conspicuous. Chapter 1004. The assessment ground was extremely vast. More than 4,000 sword of Gojoseon had entered and scattered, like a pile of sand falling into the sea. It was not easy to meet them. There were also enough tokens in the assessment ground. These tokens were all placed by the Heavenly Sword Hall before and were scattered randomly in the assessment ground. Therefore, there was no pattern to follow. One thing was certain, most of the tokens were not so easy to obtain. For example, Chu-Mu had obtained a total of 3 tokens so far. 2 of them were obtained after going through a battle. Walking on the ground of the assessment ground, not only did one have to pay attention to the surrounding terrain and environment at all times for fear of being affected by a sudden disaster, one also had to pay attention to whether there were any exotic beasts lurking around. Many of the exotic beasts in the assessment ground were like the mantis exotic beasts from before. They had the unique ability to hide their aura and figure with the help of the environment. If one was not careful, one would be ambushed, and it was impossible to guard against. Up until now, Chu Mu had already suffered over a dozen sneak attacks. Once, he had almost been killed. Fortunately, he had reacted in time and quickly dodged. Only a wound had been left on his back. The trajectory was that there was still a sinister cold energy around the wound. Fortunately, the vigorous life force of the wood phase was constantly covering the wound and dispelling the sinister cold energy, causing the wound to heal in the shortest amount of time. Chu Mu also successfully killed the exotic beast that ambushed him. Among the strange beasts in the test grounds, there were some that moved alone and some that lived in group. All of them were extremely terrifying. Battles were happening everywhere, and life and death were the most common things. There was no specific destination, just to find more tokens. Forward, forward, and forward. The whistling wind swept past, bringing with it a fiery red airflow. It was scorching hot and burned everything. Everywhere it passed, the stones on the ground suddenly became charred black. Chu Mu's figure flashed, avoiding the red flaming storm, and continued forward. Time flew, and more exotic beasts died under his sword. Finally, the Kamihira sword embryo in his middle dantian absorbed a large amount of pure negative energy and successfully advanced to the king grade. In terms of hardness and toughness, it was not inferior to an ordinary royal grade sword. It was very impressive. If it was before Chu Mu broke through, this sword embryo might be able to be used. But now, this sword embryo had to be at least at the peak of the royal grade to barely be used. In order to truly unleash its tyrannical power, it had to be at the saint grade. To reach the saint grade, it had to absorb more negative energy. Chu Mu did not know if he could achieve that after 3 months of battle and killing in the assessment ground. The chances were slim. It was worth mentioning that there were some rare spiritual herbs growing in the assessment ground. Although there were not many of them, those that could be found were definitely not young and were relatively rare. It seemed that the environment in the assessment ground was different from the outside world, causing the spiritual herbs to be different too. Suddenly, in the distance, an incomparably powerful aura shot into the sky like a volcanic eruption. It surged and shook the clouds. That aura was boundless and powerful, filled with a shocking feeling of power, as if it was going to shatter the heavens. The earth also began to tremble, startling the surroundings, causing the sword kings in the testing grounds to be affected one after another. In the sky above the 4 corners of the assessment ground, the elders on the 4 black warships opened their eyes and looked down at the assessment ground. Everything on the assessment ground was clear to them. Another rare treasure has appeared. It seems like many people are going to die here. The elders sighed, but they did not have any intention to do anything. Death was always going to happen. Life and death were originally one of the laws of nature. Moreover, the assessment ground was also to test the strength and survival ability of the sword of Gojoseon. If they were to do something this time, who would do something in the future when they faced the ferocious foreign tribes? They could only rely on themselves for everything. Although it was cruel, what the human race needed was a true expert. Only then could they protect the human race in the Archean world and live and reproduce. A rare treasure has appeared. Chu Mu stared at the place where the powerful aura was gushing out. With a thought, he immediately moved and flew towards that place. Like Chu Mu, the other sword of Gojoseon who felt the powerful aura also released their auras. Their eyes shone brightly and they all moved towards that place. Even the exotic beasts on the assessment ground were attracted. They were like a group of sharks that had smelled blood. They appeared from all directions and gathered at that place. Not long after, Chu Mu saw a group of mantis exotic beasts not far away. They were running rapidly on the ground of the assessment ground. It was worth mentioning that due to the special rules of the assessment ground, the sword of Gojoseon could not fly. Most exotic beasts could not fly either. The group of mantis mutated beasts had clearly discovered Chu Mu's figure. If it were any other time, they would definitely have charged over and killed Chu Mu. However, right now they didn't care about Chu Mu at all, and directly ran forward. Although they couldn't fly, the wings on their backs flapped, causing their speed to continuously increase. Chu Mu did not attack either. He just continued on his way. This miraculous scene could be seen everywhere on the assessment ground. What was rare was that the exotic beasts and human swordsmen were moving side by side without interfering with each other. At this time, the sword of Gojoseon was not stupid enough to draw his sword and kill the exotic beasts. That would attract the attention of a huge group of exotic beasts. They would die for sure. In the center of the assessment ground was a small mountain that was 100 zhang tall. The mountain was bare, without a single blade of grass. There was not even a trace of life. The entire mountain was golden brown, as if it was made of metal. At the top of the golden brown mountain, there was a bare tree. It was golden brown and only had one tree trunk. It was as straight as a sword, and at the top of the tree, there was a golden brown fruit. A powerful and vast aura was gushing out from the fruit, as if it wanted to shatter the heavens. Power. A pure aura of power condensed on the golden brown fruit, rippling through the air. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble and rumble. Torrents surged in from all directions. Dust and smoke billowed. Surprisingly, countless exotic beasts had gathered from all directions. Their eyes were scarlet and filled with fanaticism. They were filled with a desire for the golden brown fruit on the golden brown hill. They were filled with a desire to possess the golden brown fruit on the golden brown hill. However, these exotic beasts did not rush up the mountain immediately. Instead, they surrounded the bottom of the mountain, pressing against each other. The sword of Gojoseon, who had rushed over, could not squeeze in at all. From the golden brown mountain, a golden brown aura surged out. It spiraled like a dragon and entered the golden brown fruit. On the golden brown fruit, another ring appeared and revolved around it. There were now 6 patterns on the golden brown fruit. Even though they were far away, the sword of Gojoseon's vision was not affected much. They narrowed their eyes and looked at the golden brown fruit, carefully identifying it. Suddenly, many sword of Gojoseon cried out in surprise, "That's the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit." Chu Mu was also shocked. Information regarding the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit immediately surged into his mind. The 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit allowed one to undergo 9 revolutions and 9 refinement. The 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit was a rare heavenly treasure. It required an extremely unique environment to grow, but no one had researched it. In short, the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit was extremely rare. It was almost the same as the 5 elements sacred fruit. The effect of the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit was completely different from the 5 elements sacred fruit. Just from its name, one could tell that the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit was related to refining the body. That's right, the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit's effect was refining the body. Refining the body was also the only effect of the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit. As everyone knew, every time a swordsman broke through a major realm, the strength of the body would also increase due to the quality of the sword origin. However, the extent of the increase was not very high. Only by practicing a body-refining technique could one's body continuously strengthen and exceed the usual strength. The strength of the body was very useful to a swordsman. The stronger one's body was, the more one's physical strength would be, and the greater one's endurance and recovery ability would be. Hence, one would be able to fight for a longer period of time. Moreover, when a strong physical strength was combined with sword yuan, one would be able to unleash an even more frightening strength, causing one's strength to increase. Moreover, if one's body was sufficiently strong, one would also possess a powerful defensive ability. This would allow one to better block and weaken the enemy's attacks, allowing one to better survive. For other swordsmen, this was the effect of the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit. However, for Chu Mu, the effect of the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit was not only that. Although the strength of his body was stronger than before, and he was also practicing the fourth level of the Heavenly Wasteland sword body. Without external help, the speed of refining his body was very slow and inefficient. He did not know how many years it would take for him to truly master the fourth level of the Heavenly Wasteland sword body, causing the strength of his body to skyrocket. If he could obtain the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit, after consuming it, the strength of his body would continue to increase. At that time, he should have a strong body that could withstand the power of the earthquake. When using the earthquake, he would not need to spend so much time slowly accumulating the power of the earthquake, and he would not have to worry about causing harm to his body. Chu Mu's eyes shone with a blazing light. He was extremely eager to obtain the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. He was extremely eager, and so were the other sword of Gojoseon. Even though they did not have the power of the earthquake that Chu Mu had mastered, the increase in the strength of their bodies would also increase their strength by a few notches, greatly increasing their survivability. It could be as small as passing the assessment, or as big as being in a real battle in the future. Could play a huge role. Not only did the sword of Gojoseon want to obtain it, but the strange beasts in the assessment ground also desired it. After consuming the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit, they would undergo a qualitative transformation. It would not be an exaggeration to say that they would be reborn. They would directly become the king of the experts in their race. The effects were extremely obvious. Once the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit ripened, it was destined to be a life and death struggle. Chapter 1005. Another golden brown ring wrapped around the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. The 7th revolution. Whether it was the sword of Gojoseon or the strange beasts, their eyes were filled with a blazing light. The energy in their bodies surged and gathered, ready to erupt with their strongest attack at any time to kill the others and snatch the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. Another aura coiled up from the golden brown hill like a dragon coming out of the abyss. After circling a few times, it fell from the sky and coiled around the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. The 8th revolution. The light in the eyes of the sword of Gojoseon and the strange beasts became even more intense. Not long after, the ground trembled as if countless forces were flowing under the ground from all directions. They gathered at the foot of the golden brown hill, and then, using the golden brown hill as a conductor, they quickly rose up and rushed out again, turning into a golden brown dragon, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. It was very lifelike. This golden brown flood dragon was the last flood dragon. It attracted the attention of countless people. A majestic and vast aura shook from the dragon, turning into a storm that swept in all directions, causing people to tremble. After circling 9 times in the air, the golden brown flood dragon opened its mouth and let out a roar that shook the heavens and earth. The roar pierced through the clouds, causing the air to tremble and ripple. A powerful storm of energy swept through the void. The golden brown dragon rushed into the sky and swooped down, bombarding the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. Immediately, the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit shook violently. The 8 lines on the fruit emitted a strong light and flew out of the fruit, turning into golden brown dragons. After circling 9 times around the fruit, they rushed back into the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. In an instant, an incomparably terrifying aura that was 100 times more powerful than before suddenly swept out from the 9 reincarnation body refining fruit. The terrifying power was like a bolt of lightning that could topple mountains and overturn seas. It was as easy as crushing dry weeds and smashing rotten wood. There was nothing it could not destroy. The terrifying storm of aura swept out in all directions, shaking the heavens and earth. In an instant, the strange beasts closest to the golden brown hill were hit by the storm, unable to stop it. They were swept up and fell back. Even Chu Mu and the others, who were at the back, were affected. They could only feel a terrifying wave of energy sweep past their bodies, causing them to involuntarily become excited. The energy storm stopped, and the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit appeared in front of everyone's eyes. The 9th pattern was clearly visible. The 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit was completely ripe. In that instant the exotic beasts went crazy. They were like a pack of hungry wolves that had seen fresh meat. They madly charged toward the golden-brown mountain in an attempt to snatch the only 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit. At the same time, many of the sword of Gojoseon moved as well. They burst forth with their fastest speed, turning into streaks of light as they flew toward the 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit. There was only one 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit, but there were tens of thousands of strange beasts, and there were even more than 3,000 sword of Gojoseon. They fought over it, and the scene immediately became very chaotic. All sorts of chaotic auras filled the air, causing the airflow to reverse and storms to form. Die! The sword of Gojoseon was brandished, and the sword skills were executed, killing many exotic beasts that were unable to dodge at all. At the same time, the chaotic attacks released by the exotic beasts struck the sword of Gojoseon at the same time. The sword of Gojoseon was dismembered in the air, and its limbs were also minced. It only had time to let out a miserable cry. The baleful aura, resentment, and killing intent were extremely chaotic, and all sorts of negative auras rose up. Instantly, the surrounding tens of thousands of meters was covered in a layer of grayish-white fog. Chu Mu's expression shook as he felt the incomparably dense negative aura drifting in the air. He was overjoyed and hurriedly operated the divine weapon of slaughter. In an instant, the increasingly dense negative aura drifting in the air rushed toward Chu Mu like moths to a flame. In the blink of an eye, Chu Mu was enveloped by a layer of grayish-white fog. A large amount of negative aura poured into his body, causing Chu Mu's body to tremble. A cold and gloomy feeling instantly enveloped his entire body. Distracting thoughts filled his mind, and his killing intent howled. In front of him, it was as if countless vengeful spirits had appeared, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. The dense resentment that could not be dissipated almost wanted to devour his soul. A portion of the grayish-white aura even entered his spiritual world, wanting to corrode the sword's soul. Chu Mu was not in a hurry. With a thought, the undying sword intent was instantly activated. It swept through his spiritual world, directly killing all the negative aura, and then channeled it into the sword origin, circulating throughout his body, eliminating the side effects of the dense negative aura. He only felt his body turn cold, and his limbs stiffened. Fortunately, the undying sword intent was guarding him, and he gradually returned to normal. His almost frozen chi and blood also quickly recovered and surged. The Kamihira sword embryo seemed to have smelled the most delicious food in the world. In the middle of his dantian, a suction force exploded. In an instant, it was as if an ancient divine beast had opened its mouth, wanting to devour everything. Absorb, absorb, absorb. A large amount of negative aura flowed through Chu Mu's body and into his middle dantian. It was as if all rivers were flowing into the sea, returning to their origin. For the first time, Chu Mu had absorbed such a dense amount of negative aura. It was also the first time the Kamihira sword embryo had absorbed such a dense amount of negative aura. At this time, Chu Mu had already forgotten about the so-called 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit and was completely immersed in absorbing the negative aura. Such an opportunity was hard to come by, and the fight for the 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit had just begun. In a short period of time, no one would be able to successfully obtain the 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit. There were also some sort of Gojoseon who had the same idea as Chu Mu. They were outside of the battle and were not in a hurry to make a move. In such a chaotic battle, it was impossible to determine the winner in a short period of time. Being a hunter and making a move at the last critical moment had the highest chance of success. The sword of Gojoseon also saw the scene of Chu Mu operating the divine slaughter weapon and absorbing the negative aura. Seeing that Chu Mu was wrapped in an incomparably dense grayish-white aura, they were all stunned. What's going on with this guy? Is he cultivating some kind of special cultivation technique? Such a dense amount of negative aura, isn't he afraid of destroying his spiritual world? Although some of the Sword of Gojoseon wanted to find out more, the most important thing right now was the 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit. The intense battle became more and more intense, and the thick smell of blood that couldn't be dispersed was extremely suffocating. Corpses fell one after another, and were instantly shattered by the shockwaves of the battle. The dark green blood mixed with the scarlet blood, and it was a ghastly sight to behold. Kill, kill, kill. In order to fight for the only 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit on the golden brown hill, the strange beasts went crazy, and so did the Sword of Gojoseon. How stupid! One of the Sword of Gojoseon who was at the back of the battle and did not make a move looked at the Sword of Gojoseon who were immersed in the slaughter and seemed to have lost their minds, and a disdainful smile hung on the corner of his mouth. That's right, these strange beasts don't have high intelligence, so it's not surprising that they fell into a chaotic slaughter. However, as humans, an intelligent race, they actually lost their minds and fell into a slaughter like these strange beasts. They can't even distinguish their initial goal. If such a person were to face a foreign race, I'm afraid that he would only be giving military credit to them. The Sword of Gojoseon's words were full of disdain for the strange beasts. Indeed, the intelligence of these strange beasts was not as high as that of humans, especially when faced with a temptation like the 9 reincarnation body-tempering fruit. Their wild instincts instantly took over. Although his tone was full of disdain, what he said was not without reason. In the face of such a battle, unless one had full confidence that they could snatch the treasure in one go and successfully escape from the encirclement of enemies, one would have to stand aside and wait for the battle situation to clear up, and wait for the best opportunity to fight for it. In the face of temptation, one had to be able to maintain one's heart and not lose one's mind. Only a small portion of the people present could do that. Although Chu Mu was immersed in the operation of the slaughtering god weapon, his divine telekinesis was also paying attention to the battle situation to guard against a sneak attack. A large amount of negative aura kept surging into his body, and the Kamihira sword embryo absorbed it madly. It kept growing and becoming stronger. It had broken through to king grade not long ago, but it was now in the middle stage of king grade. It was moving toward the late stage of king grade, and then it was at the peak of king grade. As a large amount of negative aura was absorbed and poured into Yangming's middle dantian, it was filled with negative aura. Fortunately, the Kamihira sword embryo kept absorbing it, so his middle dantian did not explode. There were more than 100,000 strange beasts that had rushed here. They kept fighting and killing, and the negative aura produced was immeasurable. Finally, Chu Mu felt the Kamihira sword embryo in his middle dantian trembled all of a sudden, and a cheerful cry was heard. The sword embryo's quality improved again and broke through to royal grade. However, the negative aura in the surroundings was still very large, so it could continue to absorb and improve the Kamihira sword embryo's quality. A large number of strange beasts died, and their blood flowed like a river. It mixed with the soil and turned into a swamp. At this time, more than half of the strange beasts had died, and less than half of them were still fighting to the death. Every strange beast wanted to rush up the golden brown hill to seize the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit. A sudden change occurred. A dense buzzing sound was heard in the distance, and a group of black shadows appeared. When Yangming looked over, he saw a group of strange beasts that looked like hornets flapping their wings and flying over. With the advantage of being in the air, they quickly approached the golden brown hill. What was surprising was that these hornets did not fight. Instead, they flew toward the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit under the lead of an even larger hornet that seemed to have a crown on its head. This scene immediately changed the faces of many Sword of Gojoseon who were watching the battle. It was obvious that these hornets were somewhat organized, and they must not be allowed to seize the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit. The sword of Gojosian attacked. The sword light flickered and the sound of swords roared. The sword's skill pierced through the air and attacked the hornet. These hornets' strength was comparable to the sword of Gojosian, and they were very powerful. However, under the sword of Gojosian's sword skills, they were killed one by one, and their corpses fell like rain. The Hornet King Bee's intelligence was not low. It was not disturbed by the sword of Gojosian, and instead, it accelerated toward the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit. Damn it! Many sword of Gojosian's faces changed. Their bodies flashed, and they immediately released their sword skills to attack the Hornet King Bee. At the same time, they quickly approached the golden brown hill in an attempt to seize the 9 reincarnation body-refining fruit. Chapter 1006. Death had become the only main theme. If it were not for Chu Mu absorbing a large amount of negative aura, this place would have become a desolate place where the souls of the dead would breed. The Kamihira sword embryo in his middle dantian grew again and reached the peak of the royal grade. Next, no matter how much Chu Mu absorbed, the sword embryo was like a bottomless pit that could not be filled. It was unable to transform into a divine grade again. Chu Mu thought for a moment and knew that it was because the level of the negative aura here was not high enough. If the sword embryo wanted to transform into a divine grade again, it would need a higher quality of negative aura. The power of his divine sense was constantly paying attention to the surroundings. The appearance of the flying strange beasts had caused the battle to reach its climax. The battle of life and death had already reached its final juncture. Only Chu Mu had not made a move. Chu Mu did not make a move immediately. Sharpening the axe would not delay the work of chopping wood. The infinite desolate sword essence that was slowly flowing in his meridians suddenly changed its route and sped up. It condensed in a spiral and condensed into an even more condensed sword essence. Its color gradually turned golden. Strands of tyrannical aura dispersed from the transformed sword essence. It was controlled by Chu Mu's divine sense and locked into his body. It surged endlessly and his chi and blood roared like a dragon. In 10 breaths of time, many sword of Gojosian had died. Even more strange beasts had died. In Chu Mu's body, the infinite desolate sword essence had condensed into an even more tyrannical divine desolate sword essence. The tyrannical power in his body was like a soaring dragon. His chi and blood were abundant. It was like the accumulation of magma in a volcano that was about to erupt and soar into the sky. Wrapped in the grayish-white negative aura, Chu Mu's body shook, and he soared into the sky. Using the sword-controlling technique, he became one with the violent thunder-sacred sword, turning into a blazing white lightning sword light, instantly tearing apart the sky. With unparalleled speed, he tore apart a flying beast, the unicorn horned bee, and shot towards the 9 revolution body-refining fruit. When he used the divine wilderness sword art, his sword essence would transform, and its power would be comparable to a sword of Gojosian at the second firmament of creation realm. Chu Mu's speed was already faster than the average Ichino sword of Gojosian. At this moment, he was much faster than the average 2-star sword of Gojosian. With the vibrational force that vibrated the air, he obtained a powerful propulsive force. Coupled with the speed increase from the sword kinesis technique, he was even faster than an ordinary Samsung sword of Gojosian. With the sudden burst of power, the battle became white-hot again. It was unexpected and impossible to guard against. When someone noticed it, Chu Mu was already close to the 9 revolution body-refining fruit. Using his finger like a sword, he silently cut off the branch under the 9 revolution body-refining fruit without a trace. The 9 revolution body-refining fruit flew up and was caught by the palm formed by the power of divine sense, flying towards Chu Mu. "You're courting death." The sword of Gojosian who noticed it were furious. They wanted to seize the 9 revolution body-refining fruit, but they were tied down by the flying beasts, and no one could get close. Someone actually took advantage of the moment when they were tying down the flying beasts and suddenly attacked, instantly becoming the public enemy. Dozens of incomparably tyrannical sword skills slashed through the sky and bombarded Chu Mu. There were also the attacks of the numerous beasts. It was like a rain of light, and a hurricane roared, destroying the heavens and earth, putting Chu Mu in imminent danger. Seeing that he was about to be caught by the countless terrifying attacks, Chu Mu's expression didn't change. With a cold expression, he used Deshang's burning blood transformation without hesitation. The essence blood gathered in his body was like gasoline being ignited. With a rumble, an incomparably tyrannical power erupted, rushing through his body like a water pump. In an instant, Chu Mu's speed increased explosively, directly shaking off the various terrifying attacks. He grabbed the 9-revolution body-refining fruit and moved at a speed more than 10 times faster than the speed of sound. Merging with the Tao of space, his figure became even more elusive and untraceable as he flew through the sky. Damn it, Chase! Whether it was the human sword of Gojoseon or the native beasts of the examination ground, they all stopped fighting at this moment. They all looked in the direction that Chu Mu had left and furiously chased after him. In an instant, the human sword of Gojoseon erupted with power, using secret flying techniques to increase their speed. The flying beasts also rushed forward. The living beasts ran across the ground, kicking up clouds of dust. Countless corpses were trampled into pieces. When all the beasts left, the golden-brown mountain was covered in a layer of blood and flesh paste formed from broken corpses. Because of a single 9-revolution body-refining fruit, a large number of creatures had died here. On the black warship in the sky, the elders were all paying attention to the battle below. When they saw Chu Mu suddenly make a move and snatch the 9-revolution body-refining fruit, they were all stunned. Sword controlling technique, so he's a disciple of the West Tiger region's Flying Heaven Pavilion. This child's grasp of timing is unique. Ordinary people can't compare. What kind of secret technique is that? It actually increased his speed by so much. He even grasped the power of space law, worthy of being the #1 Fortune Gate disciple. A West Tiger Sword Shrine Elder had some understanding of Chu Mu. This child has poked a hornet's nest, daring to provoke so many powerful enemies alone. Each of the elders held the mentality of watching a good show. They wouldn't make a move to protect Chu Mu. His life and death were in his own hand. Flying at full speed, Huang Xiaolong's speed was extremely fast, even faster than an ordinary 4-star sword of Gojoseon. But there were many sword of Gojoseon chasing after Chu Mu, as well as many strange beasts. Among these sword of Gojoseon, the Samsung sword of Gojoseon and the 4-star sword of Gojoseon's speed increased explosively after using secret technique. They were not inferior to Chu Mu in the slightest. There were also some powerful flying strange beasts, such as the horned hornet, that were born with the ability to fly, so their speed was even faster. They bit on Chu Mu's tail as they gradually closed in. My cultivation is too low. Even if I use the Divine Wilderness Sword Art and Deshang's Burning Blood transformation to increase my speed, it's still difficult to shake them off. Chu Mu thought to himself. He could feel the tyrannical aura gradually closing in behind him. Incomparably sharp killing intent rushed at him like smoke signals, as cold as hell. If he continued to chase, his blood essence and sword energy would be overly consumed, which would be very disadvantageous for him. Even though he had already consumed and refined 5 kilograms of yuan liquid, causing his sword energy to reach the peak of the first layer, after using the Divine Wilderness Sword Art, the rate of consumption would increase by 10 times. He would not be able to last for long. With a quick thought, Chu Mu took out an ordinary low-grade Saint's sword from his interspatial ring. Without even turning his head, he slashed out. With 2 slashes, an azure wind blade tore through the sky. The edges of the azure wind blade emitted a layer of golden luster. It was extremely sharp and contained a terrifying aura of desolation. Alongside the azure wind blade was a purple-gold thunderbolt. It seemed to shatter the void as it descended desolately. The moment he attacked, he used two-sword technique. Under the amplification of the divine wilderness sword essence and Deshang's burning blood transformation, the power of these two-sword techniques increased by 30 times. It caused the sword of Gojoseon chasing after him to change their expressions. It was already threatening their lives. They attacked one after another, using their sword techniques to fight against the sword of Gojoseon. After shattering the two-sword techniques, they exploded. Terrifying energy blasted out in all directions, but the shock wave from the explosion blocked the pursuing sword of Gojoseon and the flying beasts for an instant. It's still because my cultivation is too low. Coupled with my insufficient grasp of the laws, the grade of my sword techniques is too low. It's not enough to kill them, let alone injure them. Chumu's thoughts raced. If there were only 1 or 2 people chasing after him, he would not be afraid. The problem was that there were hundreds of sword of Gojoseon chasing after him. Furthermore, each of their cultivation was at least at the 3rd firmament of creation. Just in terms of cultivation alone, they clearly surpassed him. In addition, they either had outstanding talent or had been a sword of Gojoseon for a longer period of time. Their grasp of the laws also surpassed his, and the grade of their sword techniques were also above his. If not for the divine wilderness sword essence and Deshang's burning blood transformation, Chumu would have long been caught. Other than the hundreds of powerful sword of Gojoseon, there were also hundreds of flying beasts that were not inferior to the sword of Gojoseon in terms of strength. On the ground there were thousands of powerful beasts running about. Once he lowered his altitude, he would be attacked at any time. It could be said that he was in a life-and-death situation, and was in imminent danger. The hundreds of sword of Gojoseon chasing after him mercilessly attacked. Sword techniques tore through the air and bombarded him. It was as if they had gathered into a sea of sword techniques that surged and roared. When they collided with each other, they exploded and turned into an even more terrifying shockwave. It was earth-shattering and earth-shattering. Lightning gathered on the horns of the hundreds of flying beasts, the single-horned horned bees. They then shot out, turning into a long river of lightning that surged and roared, filling the void. Chumu's expression slightly changed. He turned his body and quickly moved to the side. The terrifying energy was like an eruption of a mountain torrent. It rumbled as it swept over. The earth-shattering aura caused Chumu to feel a lingering fear. A sword light moved nimbly in the air, up and down, left and right, making it much more difficult for the pursuing sword of Gojoseon and flying beasts to catch up. During the pursuit, Chumu constantly used the laws of space, gradually familiarizing himself with the laws of space. However, it was still very difficult for him to shake off the pursuit with this alone. Chumu swept out with his spiritual sense. He checked the surrounding terrain to see if there was a place that would be beneficial for him to escape. He took out hundreds of thousands of high-grade origin crystals and crushed them all, turning them into extremely pure yuan qi that suddenly surged into his body and was absorbed. This allowed the greatly depleted sword energy to recover a portion of it. Stop immediately and I'll give you a quick death. Otherwise, there's nowhere for you to run. I don't care who you are, I'll tear you to pieces. The hundreds of sword of Gojoseon behind him flew into a rage after not catching up for a long time. They all cursed and threatened Chumu. If the flying beasts could speak, they would probably be the same, extremely irritable. Chumu did not move at all. His expression was cold and solemn, but he was somewhat anxious in his heart. Under the divine desolate sword art state, his sword energy was depleted too quickly. He could not replenish it in time. Furthermore, Deshang's burning blood transformation had burned more than half of his essence blood, so he could not maintain it for long. Looking down, a bold idea jumped into his mind. Even Chumu himself was shocked. However, it seemed that this was the only way to shake off the pursuit. The sword light turned and immediately turned around, falling down like a meteor. Chu Mu's actions clearly puzzled the sword of Gojoseon. They thought that Chu Mu was seeking his own death. However, there were some sharper people who immediately thought of the reason for Chu Mu's actions. Chapter 1007. The sword light fell from the sky like a meteor, whistling through the air as it blasted towards the exotic beasts on the ground. The exotic beasts also sensed it and released their terrifying attacks towards the sky, wanting to shatter the sword light. The sword light was like a small boat in the middle of a stormy sea. The attacks from thousands of exotic beasts were like a stormy sea, trying to destroy the sword light. The sword light, on the other hand, was extremely nimble. It was like a butterfly fluttering in the sea of clouds, or a willow swaying in the wind. It dodged the powerful attacks one after another, shuttling through the gaps between the attacks and falling rapidly. It was extremely dangerous, but it was safe. The thousands of terrifying attacks missed and shot towards the sky, immediately affecting the hundreds of Sword of Gojoseon and the flying exotic beasts that were about to give chase. These attacks varied in strength, but they couldn't be underestimated. Once one was hit, it was very likely that one would be injured. Most importantly, once one was hit, there would be a slight pause in one's movements, and they wouldn't be able to dodge the other attacks. It was very likely that they would be blasted into smithereens by the thousands of terrifying attacks. The hundreds of Sword of Gojoseon's faces were extremely ugly. The hundreds of flying exotic beasts were also incomparably irritable. Like a fish returning to the sea, Chu Mu quickly descended, dodging the heavy attacks and landing in the midst of the exotic beasts. Relying on his extreme speed and agility, he ran across the ground, shuttling through the thousands of exotic beasts. He tried his best to conceal his aura and quickly moved to the side. In the eyes of the exotic beasts, Chu Mu was the villain who had stolen the 9 revolutions body-tempering fruit. He was their target to kill. As such, the thousands of exotic beasts went berserk, unleashing all kinds of attacks to kill Chu Mu. However, Chu Mu dodged them and hit the other exotic beasts, causing flesh and blood to fly everywhere. After dodging the thousands of attacks, the hundreds of Sword of Gojoseon and the flying exotic beasts counterattacked one after another. In an instant, multicolored energy fell from the sky like a meteor shower. The destructive aura swept through the world, wanting to destroy the thousands of exotic beasts on the ground along with Chu Mu. Destruction had descended. Chu Mu quickly moved through the swarm of exotic beasts. In the next instant, he used the sword controlling technique again and soared into the sky, escaping as quickly as he could. A large number of exotic beasts died to the terrifying attack. Dust billowed as the terrifying energy surged into the sky like smoke, making the scene extremely chaotic. Chu Mu flew at a low altitude amidst the chaos, taking advantage of the opportunity to escape. He also knew that this was not a long-term solution, but every second was a second. Shao Chun stopped using the burning blood transformation at great perfection. His speed immediately decreased significantly. He quickly took out the golden vein blood yang pill and consumed it, recovering the more than half of his essence blood. Although his speed had decreased, because he had stopped using the great success burning blood transformation, his aura had also decreased, making it easier for him to conceal it. The elders on the black warship were paying attention to Chu Mu's every move. They wanted to see if Chu Mu would escape from everyone's pursuit or be caught and killed. Hundreds of thousands of high-grade origin crystals were crushed once again. The pure origin chi was absorbed by Chu Mu, quickly turning into sword essence to replenish his energy. Hundreds of Sword of Gojoseon and hundreds of flying exotic beasts once again discovered Chu Mu's tracks and chased after him. Although their speed was not slow, in order to chase after Chu Mu, they had used their secret techniques one after another. These secret techniques had side effects and could not be maintained for too long. Now, most of the Sword of Gojoseon's speed had decreased. If this continued, he would only be chased by the Sword of Gojoseon and flying exotic beasts. Chu Mu believed that he could not fight against so many powerful enemies by himself. Could it be that he had to hand over the 9 revolution body refining fruit? If he took out the 9 revolution body refining fruit and threw it out, he could smoothly escape. However, if he did that, all his previous efforts would be wasted. At this moment, Chu Mu suddenly felt a fluctuation in the beast space. The fluctuation was getting stronger and stronger, as if something was about to come out. Could it be that Bawang has broken out of its cocoon? With a thought, Chu Mu took the opportunity to open the beast space. Ripples spread out in the void in front of him. A figure flashed and flew out from the ripples. It was an incomparably vigorous figure with smooth lines, as if it was in line with the laws of heaven and earth. It gave people an indescribable sense of beauty. A pair of slender and sharp wings spread open, like 2 peerless blades. An incomparably tyrannical aura suddenly erupted from the not-so-majestic body like a volcano. "Master, I'll take you away." In Chu Mu's surprise, this tyrannical and beautiful exotic beast opened its mouth to speak. The blade-like wings trembled. Chu Mu was stunned to find that Bawang's wings were actually vibrating at a high frequency. The edge of the blade-like wings seemed to be shattered. In a flash, Chu Mu felt that he had landed on Bawang's back. It was as if he had torn through space and moved forward rapidly. Even the air could not stop Bawang's figure in the slightest. On the contrary, it seemed to have become a driving force like an aurora. In just an instant, the sword of Gojoseon and the exotic beasts that were chasing Chu Mu discovered that Chu Mu had actually left at a speed that left them in the dust. With their eyesight, they could vaguely see that other than Chu Mu, there was another figure. It was not a human figure, but also the figure that had stunned them. In an instant, it burst out with an incomparable speed, carrying Chu Mu away. "Chase! Don't even think of escaping." The sword of Gojoseon were furious as they continued to chase. Although their speed was slower, they believed that if they continued to chase, they would definitely be able to catch up to Chu Mu. "It's actually a strange, exotic beast. I have never seen it before." The elders on the 4 black warships were all astonished. With their spiritual strength, they had completely covered the entire test ground. Even though Bawang was extremely fast, it could not escape the detection of their spiritual strength. Sitting on Bawang's back, it was as if he had become one with Bawang. He rode the wind and broke through the waves, tearing through the void. That extreme speed was something that Chu Mu could not compare to even if he used the divine desolate sword art and Deshang's burning blood transformation. It was at least twice as fast. Twice as fast. Although it did not sound like a lot, if one thought about it carefully, they would understand how terrifying it was. It was like the difference between 2 times the speed of sound and 2 times the speed of sound. Once the speed was unleashed, in an instant, the 1 times the speed of sound would be left behind by the 2 times the speed of sound. As time passed, the distance between them would grow further and further. Bawang's instantaneous burst of speed was extremely fast. Even a 4-star sword of Gojoseon could not match it. Maybe only a 5-star sword of Gojoseon or an even higher level would be able to match Bawang's speed. The chasing aura became weak and disappeared. Chu Mu let out a sigh of relief and stopped the divine desolate sword art. He quickly took out hundreds of thousands of high-grade origin crystals and crushed them, swallowing them all to recover his sword energy. After flying for about a quarter of an hour, the Overlord's speed suddenly decreased by several times, and his tyrannical aura also weakened. "Master, my secret technique's duration is up." An exhausted voice sounded. "Go down." Chu Mu patted Bawang's back and said. Bawang's body turned and drew a beautiful arc. It formed a trajectory in the void and landed on the ground. With a leap, he landed on Bawang's back. At this time, Chu Mu had the time to carefully size up the transformed Bawang. The wings were slender and sharp, like a long and narrow blade. It was as if they could cut through anything in the world. There was a golden light flowing within them. The robust and perfect body. Every scale on its body was a perfect rhombus shape. It was fine and round, and the lines were shockingly smooth. With one look, one could tell that such a figure would face the least resistance, and its speed would also be extremely fast. The long tail had become even thinner, and the end was extremely sharp. It contained a dark golden coldness. But now Bawang's scales looked a little dim. Obviously, it was the after effect of using the secret technique. In terms of aura fluctuations, Bawang was equivalent to a swordsman at the first heaven of creation realm. But in terms of speed, after using the secret technique, it surpassed the 4-star sword of Gojoseon. It seemed that without using the secret technique, its speed was not something that the 2-star sword of Gojoseon could compare to. Then, Chumu saw a scene that shocked him. Bawang's body emitted waves of light, as if every scale had become a source of light. The light became intense and dazzling, causing Bawang's body to disappear. Then, it rapidly shrank and an incredible change happened. The light lasted for a full quarter of an hour, and the sound of bones snapping could be heard from within. It was so creepy that it made one's hair stand on end. After 15 minutes, the light faded and Bawang's body appeared again. Chumu was extremely shocked. He stared at it in a daze, unable to react for a moment. Bawang had disappeared, and in its place was a person. No, it should be said that Bawang had transformed from an exotic beast into a human. This was because the aura fluctuations on this person's body were exactly the same as Bawang's, except that it was not as intense. After transforming into a human, Bawang sized himself up from head to toe, looking very interested. Chumu also saw that Bawang's face gave him a familiar feeling. After carefully examining it, he suddenly realized that Bawang's appearance was somewhat similar to his own. This should be the result of Bawang being with him for a long time and being influenced by him. However, compared to himself, Bawang looked a few years younger after transforming into a human, as if he was a teenager less than 20 years old. Master, this is one of my talents after transforming into a beast king. The increase in speed just now is a secret bloodline technique of mine. Bawang came back to his senses and explained to Chumu. The original Bawang already possessed extraordinary intelligence. As it grew, its intelligence gradually increased, and it was not inferior to a normal human. Chumu laughed when he heard this. This time, it could be said to be extremely dangerous. He had become the enemy of 1,000 people, but fortunately, Bawang had broken out of its cocoon in time and completed its transformation. Otherwise, not only would he not be able to protect the 9 revolving body-refining fruit, he would also lose his life here. Although the 3 Tianhuang sword intents were powerful, it was impossible to kill so many strong enemies by themselves. He had to admit that his luck was not bad.